Good evening, and tonight in Victorian London, from warm New Court to flower-scented Piccadilly and the chilly Palace of Westminster, a banker whose loans steadied governments still could not get himself admitted past one very particular oath. Welcome back to Freya in Islington and Callum in Melbourne, who both commented on the last video and stayed with it to the end, and it is a real pleasure to have them here again. If it suits the hour, say where the listener is and what time it is in the comments, just as Freya and Callum did, and gently like and subscribe so these sleepy visits can keep finding the bedside. Have you ever had the odd feeling of being plainly wanted somewhere, and yet not quite allowed through the door? So the lamps lower a little, and London begins to gather around Lionel de Rothschild. There is the soft scratch of quill pens at New Court, the faint smell of leather and beeswax, and far off the colder hiss of gas in Westminster. Outside Guildhall, handshakes are already piling up around Lionel de Rothschild, newly elected for the City of London, though the oath waiting ahead still ends with 4 words he cannot honestly say. It is November of 1847. The air over the city feels crisp and clean, in the way London sometimes manages for an hour or two. Hats shine in the pale light, boots tap on damp stones, carriage wheels pass with a careful rattle. The crowd outside Guildhall is not wild. The City of London rarely does wild in any fully relaxed way. It prefers approval that has been counted, entered in proper columns, and confirmed by men who own very good coats. So the cheer that rises for Lionel has a solid merchant quality. It sounds like profit meeting principle and finding the arrangement sound. He receives it with the face he usually brings to public occasions. That face is calm and reserved. It gives very little away. It is not a cold face. It is simply a face that knows excitement can wait until after the papers are in order. Lionel is 40 years old. He is already a figure the city knows in several different ways. He is a Rothschild, which is one kind of fame. He is the head of the London House, which is another. He is also by now a man seen often enough in ordinary civic life that the extraordinary parts have grown almost familiar. That is how it happens with power in London. At first it arrives like a brass band. Then after some years, it becomes part of the furniture. New Court in St. Swithin's Lane is not noisy grandeur. It is working grandeur. Its rooms hold good desks, good ledgers, good chairs, and men who know where things are. There is warmth in the counting house. There is beeswax on the wood. There is leather at the edges of dispatch cases. There are clerks bending over figures that would make smaller firms sit down very suddenly. The family business is huge by 1847, though it does not go about shouting this into the street. It has branches in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. It has brothers, cousins, agents, couriers, codes, and habits of discretion polished until they shine. A government in one capital can need money. A railway company in another can need a loan. A prince can need help with one thing. A ministry can need help with another. Soon enough, a letter is folded, sealed, and carried. Then another letter answers it. Then figures begin to travel faster than many people do. This is the odd comfort of the Rothschild Empire. It feels both vast and domestic. One can picture Europe spread on the map. One can also picture a clerk warming his fingers over the office fire before opening the morning bag. Lionel belongs perfectly to that world. He is not theatrical. He is not given to public display. He is known for composure, for order, and for a dry patience that can outlast almost anything. He is also a deeply observant Jew. This matters quietly and completely. It shapes his meals, it shapes his home, it shapes the calendar of his days. It shapes, as London is about to discover again, the words he can say and the words he cannot. By now, the London House of Rothschild has clients of almost every grand and respectable sort. There are governments, of course. There are railway men. There are ministers who would never dream of discussing private matters in public, yet somehow arrive at New Court looking relieved. There are also those lovely half-official persons who appear to have come merely to pay a call. They have hats in hand. They have tearful expressions. They leave with slightly less careful expressions, which is often how one spots a useful banker. London society has made its peace with this long ago. It may still occasionally enjoy pretending surprise at the family's reach, But the surprise is a well-used household object. Everyone knows where it is kept. By 1847, Lionel has moved within city life for years. He has served civic office. He has given to charities. He has become one of those men whose name can appear on a committee and make the committee seem immediately more substantial. This is a special talent in Britain. A man need only sit still on quality paper, and half the room feels better already. He also has the kind of wealth that softens many old objections. Not all objections, certainly. London is too inventive for that. But enough objections to make ordinary dealings very smooth. Tradesmen are attentive. Editors are polite. Ministers are thoughtful. Even old prejudice likes to clear its throat before speaking to a very large account. At home in Piccadilly, the grandeur is warmer. Charlotte de Rothschild keeps rooms that smell of hothouse flowers and candle wax. There are mirrors that catch the light softly. There are carpets thick enough to quiet a footstep. There are chairs placed with the sort of care that suggests someone has already guessed who should sit beside whom. This is usually Charlotte. She has the serene gift of seating political life over dinner, as if it were a matter of soup and silver. The right cabinet minister somehow finds himself near the right bishop. The right bishop somehow leaves thinking a practical concession would be most Christian. Meanwhile, the fish appears at exactly the proper moment. It is a system both gentle and extremely effective. Many serious matters in London drift towards settlement between the soup and the second glass of wine. Charlotte understands this with the ease of someone folding linen. Lionel understands it too, though in a different style. He is less interested in sparkle. He is interested in steadiness. He can answer briefly. He can let a foolish remark expire from lack of nourishment. This is one reason he suits the city. The city loves a man who can remain calm, while numbers, opinions, and weather all behave badly at once. It is also one reason he can endure what is coming. For now, though, the mood is bright. The general election has brought energy to London, not reckless energy, not the sort that upsets the furniture, just the dense public bustle of a great commercial city deciding who will speak for it. The City of London is no ordinary seat. It is the square mile. It is banks, insurers, merchants, brokers, warehouses, offices, coffee rooms, and a permanent smell of paper. Its electors are men who read figures before breakfast. They like trade, order, credit, and the kind of liberty that keeps accounts balanced. If they choose a member, they do so with the pleasant belief that they know exactly what they are doing. When Lionel stands for the city, he is not arriving as an unknown curiosity. He is already woven into its daily life. Merchants know his house, directors know his signature, clerks know the messenger boys from New Court. Even the men who dislike the idea of change must admit that the name Rothschild on a bill is a comforting thing. It is almost comically practical. Europe may trust the house with sums fit to float kingdoms, yet Parliament still cannot quite decide whether to issue it a membership pass. The candidates move through a campaign that is busy, proper, and full of printed matter. There are addresses to electors. There are notices in newspapers. There are conversations in offices where tea cools on saucers and nobody admits to caring very much while caring a great deal. Supporters call, carriages arrive, cards are left, opinions are exchanged under conditions of excellent tailoring. The city is used to contests of status. It enjoys measuring men without ever admitting the pleasure too openly. Lionel's candidacy carries more than one meaning. On the plain surface, he is a banker of immense standing, seeking election in the natural seat for such a man. A little deeper down, he is also something new. He is a practicing Jew, asking one of Britain's proudest constituencies to choose him anyway. This is not the first time Britain has looked at such a question, but it is one of those times when the question has acquired very sharp shoes and excellent references. The argument against him is not simple, because simple arguments look rather shabby in the city, so objections tend to dress themselves up. Some speak of constitution, some speak of forms, some speak of Christian character in the most upholstered language available. Others speak of capacity, loyalty, public trust, and national habits. All of this sounds much finer once it has been brushed and pressed, yet there is another argument, and it is wonderfully plain. Lionel is trusted. He is trusted with money, with credit, with reputation, with delicate business, and with public standing. The men of the city know this from daily life. A person who holds half the financial threads of Europe is, to their mind, unlikely to mislay a parliamentary speech. There is a practical common sense in that. It does not solve every old prejudice, but it does make prejudice look faintly inefficient. During the election, Lionel behaves as Lionel does. He does not flash, he does not flourish, he does not suddenly reinvent himself as a roaring popular hero. That would have looked unnatural on him, and worse, it would have looked wasteful. He is courteous, he is measured, he lets others grow warm around him, he remains at a useful temperature. A man who runs New Court does not need to prove he is important. He needs to prove he is dependable. Dependable is a much more British sort of glamour. The press notices him, society notices him, political men notice him with careful eyes. Some admire the moment, some fear the precedent, some decide to wait and see whether it will all come to anything. This waiting and seeing is a beloved British pastime. It allows everyone to seem thoughtful while events continue without permission. Charlotte, meanwhile, keeps the home front looking almost absurdly effortless. Cards are answered, guests are received, flowers stand fresh in bowls, dinner appears as if by moral law. It is useful for a political household to look calm. Calm suggests legitimacy. Calm also suggests the servants are excellent, which in London can carry a point nearly as well as an editorial. At Piccadilly, one can imagine the evening talk during the campaign. A friendly Whig may lean closer over soup. A cautious churchman may murmur that times are changing. A city man may report the mood in Cornhill with the gravity of a weather bulletin. Charlotte listens. Lionel listens. The candles burn evenly. Someone is always seated exactly where Charlotte meant him to be. It helps that Lionel himself is not a man to make fuss. He has humor, but it is kept dry. He can be amused without becoming noisy. He can be patient without becoming passive. He can also be stubborn in a way that looks from a distance, almost like politeness. This will matter later. For now, it simply helps him survive public life with his collar still straight. On the day of the result, the city gives its answer with admirable firmness. Lionel is returned as Member of Parliament for the City of London. He is elected with a majority that makes the point very plain indeed. This is not a vague flirtation. This is not a hesitant experiment. The merchants and bankers of the square mile have pressed the confirmation button several times, with the conviction of men approving a sound investment. The cheering outside Guildhall has that quality. It is pleased, but not astonished. It sounds like men hearing a result they expected, and were glad to expect. Hats lift, hands reach, names are called. More than one respectable gentleman smiles in a way that suggests even his whiskers approve. Lionel bows. He shakes hands. He receives congratulations from men who know the value of restraint and are now willing to spend a little of it. There is satisfaction in the air. There is also curiosity. Not everyone is thinking about the next step yet. Many prefer the comfort of the present one. Being elected is a complete fact. It sits there nicely. It requires no theology for the first half hour. The streets around Guildhall hold that peculiar election mixture of bustle and routine. Messengers hurry with notes. Newsboys pass on the edge of the crowd. Carriages are called for and delayed. A porter shoulders through with the grim patience of a man who would like politics to stop blocking practical movement. London continues doing London things. That is part of its charm. Even on a notable day, someone is still late with papers. Someone is still worried about luncheon. Someone is still wondering whether the fog will thicken before dinner. Lionel notices small things as he often does. The tight fit of a glove at the wrist. The faint damp in the stone underfoot. The edge of cold where the afternoon light begins to thin. He is a man of large affairs who remains alert to ordinary details. Perhaps this is why he does not become grand in an exhausting way. He still lives inside the day. A supporter says something warm and admiring. Another man speaks of the honor done to the city. A third observes that it is a sign of the age. That is the kind of phrase people use when they mean something important has happened, but would rather not specify what. It keeps the conversation tidy. Lionel thanks them. He does not overstate the moment. He rarely overstates anything. If triumph passes through him, it does so wearing indoor shoes. He is pleased. He is also thoughtful. He has lived too long among forms and institutions to think any public matter is finished when the crowd says so. Somewhere behind the congratulations sits the practical machinery of Parliament. Practical machinery is often where lofty principles go to take naps. There will be papers. There will be formal steps. There will be the business of taking a seat. Britain likes to place a small ceremonial gate across every broad public road. Still, for a while, the joy is simple. Friends call at New Court. Letters arrive. Cards pile up. The office clerks, who normally work in the glow of figures, now enjoy handling a little reflected glory. Even the building seems to hold its warmth differently. The scratching quills continue. The ceiling wax melts. Yet the rooms carry a mild current of celebration, as if ledgers themselves have sat up straighter. At home, Piccadilly brightens too. Charlotte receives callers with smooth grace. Flowers are renewed. Candles are trimmed. The silver behaves beautifully, which is always a blessing in a political week. One imagines trays passing quietly through rooms while names are announced. Some visitors come from friendship. Some come from politics. A few come from that rich middle ground where friendship and politics wear nearly identical gloves. Charlotte understands them all. She can greet a sincere ally and a curious opportunist with the same lovely calm. No one leaves feeling mishandled. This is rare. It is almost a supernatural domestic power the house itself seems to approve. The drawing rooms hold conversation the way a good cup holds warmth. Soft fabrics, polished tables, flowers from the hothouse, and the low gold of candlelight all work together. They say success very gently. They say it without shouting at the furniture. For Lionel, domestic order is a comfort. He moves between New Court and Piccadilly with the ease of a man used to both paper and polish. He belongs in the office firelight and the drawing room glow. He can discuss alone at 1 hour and receive congratulations in the next, without appearing transformed by either. This steadiness is part of his public reputation. It also comes from discipline. He keeps religious observance without advertisement. He holds to it in the middle of English high society with quiet firmness. Meals must be managed. Days must be arranged. Household rhythm must respect an older rhythm. This is not theatrical piety. It is daily life. It is woven into linens, kitchens, calendars, and guest lists. It is there when Charlotte plans dinners. It is there when Lionel accepts invitations. It is there in ways polite London may notice only dimly, until suddenly the matter becomes impossible not to notice. For now, most people prefer the easier story. The city has elected a great banker. That alone is large enough for one day. Newspapers can shape it into progress, novelty, or common sense according to taste. Clubs can discuss it over port. Counting houses can discuss it over ink. Either way, the result remains. Lionel de Rothschild has been chosen. There is a pleasant solidity in that sentence. Chosen by whom? By the City of London. Not by a small corner. Not by a patron. Not by family arrangement. By the great commercial heart of the capital. It is hard to imagine a more public endorsement from the Briton of ledgers and docks. That endorsement matters because it is practical. It comes from men who value credit as a moral category. They know what trust means. They live by it. To entrust Lionel with representation is, in their own language, to certify him. He is, one might say, a Victorian verified account. The difficulty is that Westminster runs on older paperwork. As evening draws closer, the warmth of celebration begins to settle. Voices lower, guests depart in measured waves, coats are fetched, steps sound in halls. Outside, London moves toward lamplight. Inside, the talk becomes smaller and more exact. This is often when reality enters a room, not rudely, not with boots on the table, just quietly, as if it had been waiting by the door until the nicer china was cleared. Someone mentions the formal business at Westminster. The words are ordinary enough. Another man, more careful, speaks of the oath. He does not say it loudly. There is no need. Everyone close by understands at once what he means. The oath for members of Parliament still carries a Christian ending. Those are the 4 words. Simple words to many mouths. Impossible words to Lionel's. He cannot say them honestly. He will not say them dishonestly. That is the whole difficulty, and also the whole man. A less serious person might look for a convenient fog around the matter. A more theatrical person might make a display of refusing. Lionel does neither. He knows exactly what the issue is. He knows it has been there all along, sitting discreetly under the chair like an umbrella no one wishes to trip over. Some had hoped the election itself would somehow dissolve it. Britain often places touching faith in the idea that reality, when bored, may remove itself. But laws do not vanish because a result is handsome. Forms do not rewrite themselves because the city has spoken clearly. The House of Commons may be elected. The oath is still printed. This knowledge does not spoil the evening. Not fully. It only changes the texture a little. The triumph gains a seam. The warm room admits one cool draft. Lionel, with his usual composure, takes the point as he takes most points. He hears it. He stores it. He does not fuss. If he feels the oddity, he shows little of it. He has, after all, just been chosen by one of the most powerful constituencies in Britain. He is not going to stop fluttering because the state keeps its difficulties filed under ceremonial language. That would be inefficient. Charlotte, one imagines, understands the room at once. She likely notices which guest grows awkward. She likely notices which one grows helpful. She likely notices, too, who is already calculating the next dinner list. There will be men to persuade. There will be churchmen to soften. There will be friends who can be placed beside exactly the right sort of conscience over soup. The machinery begins before anyone calls it by name. At New Court the next morning, work continues as always. Pens scratch. Clerks sort correspondence. Firelight glows on polished wood. Great business does not pause because constitutional forms have developed a delicate conscience. Yet the election sits over everything like a mild new light. Lionel is still the same man at the same desk. He is also now the elected member for the City of London. Both facts are true. Only one has been fully accepted by Parliament. And so the hidden history begins in the most British possible way, not with a dramatic clash, not with raised voices, with congratulations paperwork, and one patient man who has every democratic right to enter the chamber and must, for the moment, remain just outside it. The morning begins with a shirt that is cooler than the room and smooth from careful ironing. Lionel de Rothschild stands by the bed and lets his valet settle the linen over his shoulders. The cloth whispers as it falls, and the cuffs wait like small promises at his wrists. His waistcoat comes next, pearl gray and neat, with buttons that catch a weak slice of London light. The black coat follows with the patient ceremony of any good coat. It asks for straight shoulders, a still chin, and no nonsense at all. He dresses like a man with nothing to prove, which is often the strongest form of dressing. The linen is fresh, the boots are polished, the watch lies warm in his palm before it disappears into its pocket by a short gold chain. On a chair nearby rests the hat he will carry later under his arm. Beside it lie gloves of soft leather, smelling faintly of tannin and beeswax. The whole arrangement looks calm enough to lower a pulse by several beats. Breakfast is plain and exact. There is coffee, dark and hot, and bread that breaks with a dry little crack. There is butter, cool at first, then softer near the silver knife. He does not hurry the tray. He does not peck at the food like a worried bird. He eats as a banker eats on a serious morning, which is steadily and without theatrical sacrifice. A footman brings letters on a salver with the grave face of a man presenting minor weather reports. Notes arrive from the city, from friends, from men who believe the obvious should stay obvious. One letter carries a blot of sealing wax on the fold, like a small berry. Charlotte has already been awake long enough to know half the day's direction. In the Piccadilly house, the drawing rooms still hold the scent of warm candle wax and hothouse flowers. Even the camellias seem to understand that politics should be handled quietly, near upholstery. She asks one or two plain questions over the breakfast table. He answers in the same tone. Between them, a great public matter sits down and behaves itself like a well-trained guest. Charlotte is thinking ahead to dinner, as she often is when legislation needs help. She has a gift for placing one cabinet minister beside one sympathetic bishop with uncanny ease. She conducts the soup course like a gentle military campaign, only with better silver and fewer mats. Lionel leaves the house with papers in his case and the hat now properly in hand. The front steps are clean from an early brushing. The morning air carries coal smoke, damp stone, and the faint smell of horse from the street. The carriage ride west to east gives London in layers. Hooves strike sparks of sound from the road. Shop fronts slide by in glass and wood and painted signs, while clerks hurry with folded collars and fixed intentions. At the crossing points there are carts, drays, omnibuses, and people who all believe their own business matters most. London lets everyone keep that belief for a few streets. It is one of the city's kinder habits. He passes from the warmth of private rooms toward the public chill of Westminster. The sky is pale and undecided. The river air has a wet edge that finds its way past coat and cuff without much effort. The Palace of Westminster rises from the day like a very large answer to a question nobody quite asked. Stone walls meet the light with solemn patience. The windows hold a dim shine, and the towers seem busy merely by existing. This is the first arrival there as a new member for the City of London. The fact sits plainly enough in the carriage. It is almost comical that a man trusted with vast sums should need guidance about one doorway. New Court and St. Swithin's Lane could have lent half the building its confidence if confidence had been a material carried in crates. Its credit stood firmer than that of many crowned heads. Yet this original institution still could not obtain the membership pass for the chamber it had effectively bankrolled. He steps down with care because the stones are damp and political dignity benefits from stable footing. A servant takes one thing, another servant points another way. Westminster begins, as many great machines do, with a corridor and a man giving directions. Inside, the air changes at once. The oak paneling keeps a deep old chill, even under the lamps. Gas hisses softly above, and the sound is so steady that it almost pretends to be silence. He walks through passages that smell of wool, paper, polish, and a little ash from old fires. Boots ring on stone, then dull themselves on rugs. Here and there stand men who look as though they have been waiting since the reign of Henry VII. A clerk leads him on with professional briskness. The clerk carries papers close to his chest and speaks in a voice trained to survive corridors. Nothing in the man's expression suggests surprise that history often arrives wearing decent broadcloth. There are other new members moving through the same current. Hats are tucked under arms, coats are brushed smooth again by habit. Faces hold a blend of pride and uncertainty that makes grown men resemble schoolboys in excellent tailoring. Lionel keeps his own pace. He is not a man who fidgets to prove sincerity. He has spent enough years moving through rooms where fortunes change hands over soup and a nod. At the entrance to the chamber stands the doorkeeper of the house. He has the look of an overworked guardian of rituals, which is a particular Westminster species. His clothes are correct, his posture firm, and his eyes already faintly tired of the century. The man gives a small bow and a careful glance toward the proper path. It is not friendship exactly. It is the compact respect of professionals who know a procedure will soon become awkward. The chamber opens ahead in green and wood and controlled light. The benches glow softly under the lantern ceiling. Brass catches the lamps in small, warm points, while the air remains stubbornly cool around the ankles. It is not a grand room in the way a ballroom is grand. It is tighter than that, and stranger. It feels like a place designed for voices, papers, tempers, and the slow grinding of words against rules. He notices the table, the books, the formal order of objects waiting to be used. There is a Bible ready for the oath. There are papers aligned with the neat severity of men who trust columns and margins. There is also that peculiar hush public rooms can make when they know a moment is simple and troublesome at once. Conversation does not stop entirely. It thins and lowers itself, like steam turning to mist over a pan. He has every democratic right to enter this chamber as a member for the City of London. The voters have done their clear and ordinary work. They have, in modern language, clicked the confirmation button with notable firmness. Yet Westminster loves a narrow gate. Westminster loves a phrase, a formula, a little ceremonial knot that must be picked just so. It has the calm stubbornness of a very expensive club, insisting on the correct shoe. He approaches the table when his turn comes. The hat is under his arm now. The gloves are folded inside it, and the brim presses lightly against his coat sleeve. The clerk stands ready with the words. He has read them many times before, and his face gives nothing away. Routine is one of the clerk's chief talents, and, on this morning, routine acquires a sharp edge. The Bible lies open for the form to be taken. Its leather cover is dark and a little worn at the corners. The pages have that fine, dry look of paper that has been thumbed by generations of confident Christians. The oath begins in the usual manner. Lionel can hear each word clearly in the chamber air. The form binds loyalty to the crown and duty to the law, and none of that troubles him at all. He is prepared to swear true allegiance. He is prepared to bind himself as any honest member would. There is no dispute there. and no theatrical difficulty borrowed for effect. Then the clerk reaches the final phrase. It lands gently enough on the ear. It is short. It is familiar. It is, in practical terms, a locked door the size of 5 words. The words are these: on the true faith of a Christian. They are not hidden in a footnote. They are not softened by custom into harmless dust. They stand there plainly and ask a Jewish man to declare what he cannot declare. That is the whole problem, and it is exact. Lionel cannot honestly say that he swears on the true faith of a Christian. He can swear loyalty. He cannot borrow another man's creed, as if it were a spare umbrella in the hall. The room, having expected some sort of movement, becomes very still instead. Stillness in Parliament is a rare and rather refined product. It arrives like a pause in bad weather, brief and noticeable. He does not protest in a blaze. He does not raise his voice. He simply declines to swear in that form because conscience is stubborn in a quieter way than vanity. His refusal is public and dignified for the excellent reason that it is also simple. He will not say false words. He will not pretend that a phrase means less than it means. There is something almost domestic in the shape of the moment. A clerk has read a line. A member has said no to that line. An empire now discovers it can be delayed by the verbal equivalent of a badly placed teacup. He takes back his place with the same calm with which he approached it. The hat settles more firmly under his arm. One glove slips a little inside the brim and is tucked back without fuss. Then he turns and leaves the chamber. That is all. The action is so measured that it becomes larger in memory than many louder scenes. At the door, the doorkeeper meets his eye for a second. He offers a small apologetic nod, professional and almost tender. It is the nod of a man who has seen regulations perform their odd little dances before. Behind Lionel, the chamber stirs. A few faces harden at once, pleased to discover principle in the shape of exclusion. A few others look embarrassed, as though the furniture itself should have handled things better. There is support in the room, and there is outrage, and there is the special Westminster mood of men sensing procedure. Some hear conscience, some hear danger. Many hear a chance to discuss precedent at inconvenient length. Outside the chamber, the corridors feel cooler than before. The same gas lamps hiss, the same rugs soften steps, yet each object now seems to belong to a building that has politely refused one of its own elected guests. He moves through it without haste. Haste would suggest injury. He offers nobody the gift of a flustered retreat, which is wise, because public life can dine for weeks on a badly arranged expression. Before long, word has traveled beyond the walls. Reporters gather the matter as crows gather bright scraps. By noon, the city is chewing over the sentence as if the sentence were a piece of bristle. Some papers praise the dignity of the refusal. They note that a man may be fit to guard the nation's credit, yet still be barred by one confessional tag tied to a legal oath. Other papers discover grave alarm with surprising speed. They warn that the Constitution trembles if one syllable shifts. This makes the Constitution sound like a pudding held together by string, which is unkind to puddings. At New Court, the counting house goes on being warm. Quill pens scratch over paper in a dry, steady chorus. Good leather and beeswax lend the rooms a settled smell that seems to prefer reason over display. Clerks carry ledgers with both hands, because ledgers have weight, even before one counts the numbers inside. Messengers come and go. Seals are broken. Sand is shaken over fresh ink, in small, careful drifts. Lionel returns there later, to the familiar order of the place. He removes his gloves and lays them by a stack of correspondence. The desk takes his hand again, as if public absurdity were just another item for afternoon review. There is comfort in the office rhythm. A tray arrives with tea. Cups stand on saucers with a soft click. A fire gives off a mild heat that reaches the knees before it reaches the room. Men come in to ask practical questions about bills, shipments, and accounts. No one enters saying with operatic despair that Parliament has behaved oddly. In New Court, oddity must queue behind exchange rates and railway paper. Yet the political consequences spread at once and then settle into shape. Friends in the Commons speak up. Enemies speak more loudly. The central fact remains stubbornly plain and therefore annoyingly hard to evade. The oath is fixed by law. The House cannot simply decide that words no longer matter today because a man of bit sense has arrived. To alter the form requires legislation. which means agreement, which means Westminster's favorite hobby of declining agreement. So the deadlock begins in quiet shoes. Members may admire Lionel and still claim their hands are tied. The chamber has elected sympathy in places, but sympathy does not rewrite statute with a shrug. The House of Lords will soon prove itself history's most exclusive velvet rope policy. Men in ermine will explain that they oppose nobody in principle. They merely object to the very specific Jewish gentleman whom the voters keep sending back. Among the voices in support stands Benjamin Disraeli, who is both sincere and complicated in a way only Benjamin Disraeli could manage. He speaks warmly for Jewish relief. Then he finds smaller reasons not to push with full bodily weight against his own party fence. His position has layers. Jewish by birth and Anglican by baptism, he carries his personal history like a fine embroidered coat, turned partly inside out. It shines, it pinches, it never quite lets the room forget itself. When he speaks on the matter, many listen with real feeling. He can make even principle sound upholstered and flattering. Yet one senses he would prefer not to stand too long beneath a lamp labeled with the very puzzle of his own life. Lord Lyndhurst offers a different style altogether. He is elderly, sharp, and wonderfully committed to saying no with polish. Each Jewish disabilities removal bill gives him fresh purpose, like a retired cat discovering a sunbeam that belongs entirely to objection. He does not simply object. He arranges objections in handsome constitutional rows. He can make denial sound like the final form of public duty, delivered by a man who has ironed every fold of his reasoning. Meanwhile, the absurdity remains personal and physical for Lionel. He had stood in the chamber, he had heard the clerk, he had met the Bible, and the hush, and the short impossible phrase. There are moments in public life when the whole machine reduces itself to one ordinary item: a pen, a key, a door. In this case it is a line of words, brief enough to fit on a visiting card. He might have spoken them falsely, and sat down among the green benches. Many men through history have swallowed worse things than 5 awkward words. But Lionel is not interested in winning entry by means that leave a bad taste forever. That quality is harder than it looks. It is not a banner waving in weather. It is more like refusing the wrong figure in a ledger, because the figure is wrong, even if the sum would please everyone present. At home, Charlotte receives callers and notes with the calm efficiency of a skilled hostess running a soft siege. A bishop is remembered. A minister is invited. A cousin who knows a useful editor is treated to tea so good that resistance seems faintly impolite. Her drawing room does its own work on the world. Warm candle wax sweetens the air. Hothouse flowers lift a green damp scent from their leaves. The chairs are placed to encourage candor and prevent escape. At dinner, she seats people with that serene precision which has already improved many public questions. One man finds himself beside precisely the prelate he most hoped to avoid. Another discovers that soup can arrive carrying moral pressure in a silver tureen. Tonight the soup is clear and rich, with barley, carrot, and a little parsley on top. Spoons move, napkins rise. In the gentle steam above the bowls, objections begin to soften around their edges. Charlotte never appears to force matters. She merely arranges the weather in which views become more reasonable. It is hard to defend exclusion robustly while accepting a second helping from such careful hands. Lionel, for his part, speaks of the event without self-pity. He describes the facts. He leaves out any tremor the newspapers might have liked. This is often the best way to make absurdity visible, because absurdity hates good manners. He explains that he could swear every part except the Christian declaration. He says this almost as though discussing a clause in a contract or a delay in shipping. Precision is his native language, and precision happens to make the issue plain. That plainness irritates opponents more than anger would. Anger can be called passion. Plainness sits there like a clean plate, refusing decoration. The difficulty is not emotional. The difficulty is written down in words anyone can read. Soon there are proposals and counter-proposals. Could he take the oath on the Old Testament alone? Could the House permit a different form? Could some clever compromise shave the edges off the phrase without alarming the ancient furniture? Each suggestion runs into the same wall. Some men fear change itself. Others fear appearing to invite change. A few seem mainly concerned that Westminster should never be seen to have made life easy for anyone not already inside. So Lionel waits and works and presents himself when required with the same level temper. He becomes, almost accidentally, the image of a patient claimant outside a room that has already been paid for. The picture is too neat for history to resist. The doorkeeper will come to know him well in time. On each approach there will be that same small nod of apologetic recognition. It will pass between them like a modest professional friendship, born of repeated failure to satisfy a very old script. For now, the first encounter remains the sharpest in outline. The green benches, the lantern light, the clerk reading from habit, the expectant quiet that suddenly had nowhere useful to go, and above all, the phrase itself remains absurdly small. On the true faith of a Christian. 5 words after the real oath. 5 words standing like a tiny iron gate before a fully elected member. The City of London had sent him there in perfect legal seriousness. Voters had done their part with no visible confusion. Parliament now behaved like a Victorian-era verified account, refusing approval despite repeated confirmation from every proper source. There is support, and there is opposition, and there is constitutional deadlock dressed in sober cloth. None of it alters his conduct on that first day. He enters with composure, declines with honesty, and leaves with the same measured step. By evening, London has filed the matter into memory and argument both. Lamps are lit behind curtains. Carriages roll on wet streets. In countless houses, people discuss the question over tea, over claret, and over bread that has gone a little stale. At New Court, the day's papers lie folded near the ledgers. At Piccadilly, the candles burn lower in their sticks. Lionel removes his coat, unfastens his cuffs, and lets the long public absurdity settle beside the ordinary work of living. Nothing dramatic has happened, which is partly why the moment lasts. A man came to take his seat. A ritual asked for the wrong words. He kept faith with himself, retrieved his hat, and walked back out into the London air. The paper with the oath feels thin between Lionel's fingers in the oak-paneled chill. The gas lamps hiss above him with patient little breaths. The green benches hold their deep color under the lantern light. At the end of the words sit 4 small ones. They look almost shy on the page. They have the quiet power of a footman who closes the door with perfect manners. The doorkeeper stands nearby with his careful face and his polished shoes. He has seen this approach before. He gives Lionel the small nod of one patient man greeting another. There is no scene and no storm. There is only a pause at the bar of the house. There is the faint smell of wool, lamp oil, and old paper. The words are plain enough for any schoolboy to sound out. That is part of their mischief. Laws often arrive dressed like well-behaved sentences, then spend a century blocking the hall. These 4 had not dropped from the sky by accident. They came from the old nervous years after kings returned, and old fears returned with them. England had a talent for stitching anxiety into statute, and then forgetting who had done the sewing. Back in those 17th century decades, men in wigs kept adding locks to public life. One oath promised loyalty to the crown, another rejected certain church claims, another asked a man to say who he was not, which was a very busy use of an afternoon. The clause about the true faith of a Christian settled into this growing bundle of promises. It was one line in a larger habit. The country had built a legal cupboard full of religious tests and then grown used to dusting around it. By Lionel's day, many people no longer saw the cupboard at all. They bumped against it from time to time. Then they blamed the bruised shin and not the furniture. At New Court in St. Swithin's Lane, the morning fire gives off a steady good heat. Quill pens scratch in quick dry bursts. The room smells of leather cases, sealing wax, and beeswax rubbed into polished wood. Clerks carry ledgers with both hands as if they were trays of pudding. A messenger leaves damp footprints from the street and apologizes to the floor. Outside, carts rumble over stones with the soft, stubborn rhythm of London doing business. Lionel sits where papers arrive in neat stacks and leave in neater ones. He reads the oath again with his gloves set beside the blotter. The black ink shines for a moment before it goes dull. He knows those 4 words are not alone. They belong to a whole architecture of old exclusions. The building is so old now that many people treat it like the weather. A Jew in Britain may grow rich and useful and widely known. He may lend money to men who write laws. He may attend dinners where those men praise prudence while taking another spoon of turtle soup. Yet the doors of office have long had their own little hinges. Some posts asked for sacramental tests. Some universities kept their gates friendly at the porter and narrow at the chapel. Old rules lingered in towns and corporations and learned places. A man might be welcome in the counting house and unwelcome in the council room. Britain had many such arrangements, each one small enough to seem almost decorative. That was the sleepy genius of legal disability. It did not always roar. It preferred to whisper from printed forms and to wait by the inkwell. The thing was not even tidy. Catholics had their own barriers and then saw some removed. Dissenters had spent years stepping around church tests like guests avoiding a wet patch on the carpet. Some changes had already come. Jews could be sheriffs in London after a useful bit of lawmaking. The sky did not fall, and the city continued to buy fish, mislay umbrellas, and complain about paving stones. That was always awkward for the defenders of old exclusions. A reform would happen in one corner. Nothing dramatic followed except paperwork. Then another old barrier looked less like a fortress and more like a forgotten screen. Lionel's life made this awkwardness visible every day. New Court had a credit stronger than many states, yet the institution that helped steady national finance still could not obtain the simplest membership pass for the chamber it had effectively bankrolled. He does not often waste emotion on the point. He is too well trained for that. He turns a page, taps it square, and asks for another letter to be copied. The clerks know the shape of this argument by now. They know which packet goes to a minister. They know which newspaper asks for a sober statement and which wants spice with breakfast. In the front room, callers wipe the damp from hats and wait on horsehair chairs. The coal scuttle gives off a black iron smell. A young clerk warms his hands and pretends he is not listening. News from Westminster arrives folded and ribboned, then opened and flattened. One day brings a hopeful note from a friend. Another brings a speech full of courtesy and quite a lot of no. The wider country is changing faster than its forms admit. Railways carry people who never expected to travel so far. Telegraph wires begin to make yesterday feel old by tea time. Yet Parliament still asks its chosen members to walk through words fitted for another age. It is like installing a modern counting machine beside a door that opens only if one produces a lace cuff. Britain could be wonderfully advanced right up to the exact point where it was not. At Piccadilly, Charlotte's drawing rooms glow with candle wax and hothouse flowers. The air is warmer there than in Westminster and much kinder to the hands. A servant moves through the room with a tray of clear broth and silver spoons. Charlotte has her own way with public life. She studies guest lists as if they were military maps, only with better linen and less shouting. By soup, she has often placed the right bishop beside the right minister, with the calm skill of a woman who knows legislation likes a good table. Lionel does not say much while a fish course arrives. He never needs to fill the air. Others do that for him, which is one of the pleasures of influence. A cabinet man leans closer over turbot and asks about the bill. A bishop dabs his mouth and speaks of justice in tones suitable for decanters. Charlotte nods once and signals for the claret as if moving a small but important piece on a board. Everyone in that room knows the obstacle, though they describe it in different fabrics. Some call it prejudice, some call it constitutional scruple, some call it an inherited difficulty, which is a very upholstered way of saying the same thing. Lord John Russell is not upholstered. He is dry, spare, and steady. He brings reform the way a clerk brings a ledger, with little music and a good deal of persistence. In the Commons he moves a bill to remove the Christian words from the parliamentary oath. He does not gild the point. The elected chamber has chosen a man and should be able to seat him. The House receives the measure with less thunder than earlier years might have promised. Hats are set down, papers are shuffled. Men who have heard the case before settle into their places with the look of diners greeting a familiar course. Russell speaks in that plain Whig way, which sounds almost dull, until one notices it keeps winning rounds. He treats the matter as simple justice and practical good sense. He also treats Parliament as a body that ought not to trip over its own doorstep. That tone helps. Great moral performances can tire a house after dinner. A man who offers a clean amendment and a short speech sometimes looks wonderfully refreshing. Some members support the bill because they believe exclusion is wrong. Some support it because the City of London has already made its wish embarrassingly clear. Some support it because the present arrangement now feels faintly absurd, which in Britain is often the beginning of reform. It is not ideal for Parliament to tell the largest commercial constituency in the kingdom that its vote was interesting but not actionable. The city has clicked the confirmation button for Lionel again and again. Westminster keeps saying the account remains pending. Disraeli rises at times with warm and moving words. He can speak about Jewish exclusion with a note nobody else can quite copy. He also somehow leaves room for private calculations, which is very much his gift, and perhaps his exercise plan. Lionel listens without much show. He knows Disraeli's mind is a house with many mirrors. Still, an ally who speaks beautifully is useful, even when he walks with delicate care around his own reflection. The Commons like speeches that let it feel both liberal and sensible. This question allows a generous amount of both. Members can defend religious liberty while also appearing modern and brisk, which is a very tempting combination. The division comes and the bill passes with reasonable ease. There is no heavenly sign and no broken panel in the chamber. Men collect gloves, talk of trains, and drift out into the London night. In New Court the next morning, the coal has been laid before dawn. Clerks break the wafer seals with thumbnails. One of them smiles, before he remembers that offices prefer faces as orderly as their books. Lionel reads the result over coffee that has gone slightly bitter on the tray. The silver pot leaves a ring of warmth on the cloth. He folds the paper once and sets it beside a heap of correspondence tied with blue tape. Success in the Commons feels real and also incomplete. Everybody knows where the bill must travel next. Everybody knows the upper house keeps a firmer hold on old furniture. The Lords receive such measures with that special calm which means resistance has already been ironed and folded. Ermine shows white against red benches. Gold lace catches lamplight in little patient sparks. The chamber is handsome in a chilly way. You can almost feel the nap of the cloth on the benches. You can almost hear old objections settling into place before a man has spoken them aloud. Lord Lyndhurst is elderly now, and entirely equal to the task of opposing reform at length. He has found in this subject a lasting second youth. Some men take the waters for vigor, and he takes Jewish emancipation bills. He stands and begins the sort of speech that arrives furnished. There are constitutional principles in sturdy rows. There are precedents polished like old teaspoons and brought out for company. His manner is not crude. That is part of the trouble. He sounds like a man protecting the nice order of a sideboard from one alarming new cup. He argues that the Christian character of Parliament cannot be altered so lightly. He speaks of the relation between legislature and established church. He warns that a member who cannot truly take the whole oath cannot honestly sit beneath it. Peers who agree nod in grave comfort. Peers who do not agree still admire the workmanship. Even those who wish him elsewhere must concede that he can say no with a very expensive finish. There is always a constitutional objection available in Westminster if one looks long enough. Lyndhurst looks very hard indeed. He can turn a doorway into an ancient principle before the lamps have burned halfway down. He is especially fond of the idea that the oath is not a loose phrase, but part of the kingdom's frame. Remove one phrase, he suggests, and who knows what else will ask to be moved. It is the domestic argument against rearranging a chair, because soon the piano may be in the street. Some peers mutter that the Commons is pressing too fast. Some wonder whether Jews may help shape laws touching the church. One might think Lionel planned to revise the prayer book between luncheon and tea. Others answer that the House already includes men of many shades of belief and seriousness. Not every Anglican conscience arrives in identical wrapping paper. Parliament has somehow survived that discovery. Still, Lyndhurst has the room's habits on his side. The Lords can make delay sound like duty. They can treat exclusion as a form of caretaking, rather as one might refuse a guest the drawing room because the carpet is old. It is history's most exclusive velvet rope policy. The men in ermine insist they are not opposed in principle. They merely object to the specific gentlemen who keep being democratically elected and then inconveniently arriving at the door. The debate runs on in that polished upper air where objections gather polish with every repetition. A cough travels the chamber. A peer adjusts his spectacles and feels reinforced by their very shape. Outside, the doorkeeper keeps his own small vigil. He knows the routes through corridors and the moods of members. He also knows Lionel's hat brim and the sound of his step better than most relatives know a favorite uncle. When the measure fails to proceed, no one overturns anything. Westminster is too practiced for that. The refusal comes wrapped in forms which is the British way of making disappointment wear clean gloves. Lionel receives the news with the same still face he brings to exchange rates and weather. He had expected better, and not depended on it. Patience is easier to maintain when one has been forced to rehearse it in public. He leaves the palace through stone passages that hold the days cool even after sundown. The lamps throw soft pools along the floor. Behind him, the house continues its business as if it had not just tied its own laces together. Back at Piccadilly, dinner waits with proper punctuality. The napkins are folded in firm white shapes. A tureen sends up steam, scented with barley, leek, and the sweet faint note of turnip. Charlotte hears the result before the fish is served. She only asks for the list of peers and reaches for a pencil. Her gift is not for lament. Her gift is for seating plans and second attempts. If a bishop admired the apricot tart and a minister praised the port, she remembers both and acts accordingly. The drawing rooms remain calm that evening. Someone plays a little music. Someone else comments on the weather with relief, because the weather never needs emancipation. Yet the talk of the bill travels well beyond private rooms. It moves through newspapers, pamphlets, clubs, coffee rooms, railway carriages, and breakfast tables set with toast racks and impatience. Britain does love a public question when it can be discussed over marmalade. Printers set the words in columns dense enough to challenge strong morning eyes. The paper leaves a gray dust on the fingers. A reader turns the sheet and leaves a half-moon of jam near the advertisements. Leading articles explain civil rights in tones of grave fairness or grave alarm. Pamphlets answer pamphlets, with titles almost as long as their arguments. A bookseller's window can look like a quarrel dressed in stitched paper. Some writers speak of national justice and equal citizenship. They point out that a man trusted with wealth, charity, and public respect should not stumble over 4 inherited words. They ask why the state insists on a Christian ending to a civic promise. Others insist the Constitution is Christian in its very bones. They fear a slippery line and cherish it. They write as though the kingdom were a teapot that might crack if handled by the wrong pair of hands. The odd thing is how often the same examples return. The city elected Lionel. He declined the oath as worded. The House left the seat empty. Then everybody wrote about it again in nearly the same sentences, as if the nation were proofreading itself. In clubs, gentlemen discuss the matter over chops and claret. In counting houses, clerks lower their voices and look pleased to have an opinion. On omnibuses, one man says it is common sense, and another says it is impossible. Then both pay the conductor and continue onward. Jewish papers and Christian papers join the chorus in different keys. Some are eager and some are wary. All understand that a few printed words have become the nation's favorite small stone in the shoe. Pamphleteers are very fond of history when it agrees with them. One reaches back to old statutes and presents them like family silver. Another reaches to the same shelf and asks why everyone is still eating off it. Even the language of rights begins to sound more familiar in these years. The old arrangements are not defended with quite the same easy confidence. People are growing used to asking whether a rule serves a real purpose or merely enjoys its lodgings. That question is dangerous to old exclusions. Most of them survive by being taken for granted. Once a clerk or a reader pauses and asks why, the furniture starts to look movable. At New Court, letters arrive from supporters in careful hands. Some offer legal points, some offer sympathy. A few offer advice that would be more useful if it had been asked for. Lionel opens them with a paper knife smooth from use. The blade catches the light and slips under the seal. He reads each note with the same steady attention he gives to market reports. One correspondent praises his patience as a public lesson. Another wishes he would make a stronger show. Lionel is not built for theatrics, and London has already supplied more actors than any city requires. His plight itself becomes part of the argument. A man excluded with noise can be called troublesome. A man excluded with perfect composure begins to make the exclusion look fussy. He presents himself. He reaches the words he cannot honestly speak. He withdraws. Even the doorkeeper now treats it like a sad little office routine that ought to have been corrected in a better managed department. There is something almost comic in the repetition. The city chooses him. Westminster nods at the choice and then hides behind 4 syllables and a churchly tailpiece. Lionel has become a Victorian verified account that Parliament still refuses to approve, though the public keeps pressing refresh. The newspapers notice the comedy too, though in sober ink. Some ask how long the legislature intends to reject what the electorate plainly intended. Some merely reprint speeches and let the absurdity do its own quiet work. Russell does not give up after one failure. He is accustomed to the long walk of reform. He knows British change often moves by inches, then pretends it had planned to arrive there all along. In the Commons, supporters keep the matter alive with questions and bills and repeated votes. The routine itself becomes familiar. A measure is drafted, introduced, debated, sent upward, and then met by the old careful wall. Disraeli continues his eloquent balancing act. He can sound sincerely moved by Jewish claims, while never quite abandoning the pleasure of intricate positioning. One suspects he could fence with a hat stand if it offered sufficient elegance. Charlotte continues her calmer campaign with menus and names. A luncheon can be as useful as a division list when managed by the right hands. She knows which guest prefers sole, which bishop likes Madeira, and which politician becomes almost reasonable after custard. At times, Lionel seems to live in three buildings at once. There is the warm discipline of New Court. There is the polished diplomacy of Piccadilly. There is the draughty refusal of Westminster, waiting like a room that cannot decide whether it has invited him. He moves among them with his usual exactness. His coats are brushed and dark. His linen sits fresh at the neck. A servant lays out gloves and hat with the calm precision that England brings, even to frustration. The phrase at the heart of all this remains strangely small. On the true faith of a Christian. It can be spoken in a breath and defended for hours. That is another lesson of the period. Great systems often rest on tiny phrases. A broad disability may hide inside one polite line, much as a draft can enter under a splendid door. By the late 1850s, many people are tired of hearing that the matter is impossible. It has been debated too often and too publicly. Each refusal makes the old rule seem less sacred and more merely stubborn. The Lords do not enjoy being made to look stubborn, though they will endure it for principle and habit. Still, the pressure of repeated elections and repeated Commons votes has a wear of its own. Even velvet ropes fray when enough people politely ask who exactly they are for. For now, though, Lionel remains outside the full rights of the seat he has won. He keeps his papers in order. He answers letters. He goes to dinner and to the House and back again. The national conversation goes on with its cups and columns and folded sheets. Men argue in print and in person. Women host evenings where arguments soften over soup and sharpen again over nuts. In that world, the issue is no longer hidden at all. The old clause has been held to the light. People can see the seams where history stitched fear into routine and called it constitutional order. Lionel's part in this is almost stubbornly simple. He does not shout at the seam. Then he waits for enough of the country to notice the same loose thread. The doorkeeper's apologetic nod remains one of the smallest and kindest honors in Westminster. It asks for nothing and promises nothing. It simply admits that a sensible arrangement would have spared both men this repetition. So the chapter closes with the same cool corridor and the same folded words. Gas lamps hiss above carved stone. The house keeps its forms, and Lionel keeps his composure, which is often the stronger possession. The morning paper lies open on Lionel de Rothschild's desk at New Court. The ink is still a little damp at the fold. The room smells of good leather, beeswax, and the faint iron note of fresh rain on London stone. A clerk warms his hands near the fire before taking up his pen. Another sorts letters with the soft flick of thick paper against his cuff. Quills scratch in a steady little chorus that always sounds busier than it feels. The election result sits there in black type with a calm face. The City of London has chosen Lionel again. It does not look excited on the page, though everyone in the room understands the point perfectly well. There is no cheering in New Court. There is only that deep banking house habit of noting a large matter in much the same way as a small one. A man coughs politely. A sandshaker taps once against the rim of an inkstand. Lionel reads the line once more and smooths the paper flat. He does not need to ask what it means. The city is no longer merely voting for a member. It is repeating itself on purpose. That repeated choice has its own slow music. It is not loud like a rally or sharp like a protest. It is more like a clerk entering the same figure again because the first entry was correct. His coat hangs warm from the fire screen behind him. The wool has taken on a little of the room's heat. When he puts it on, the sleeves settle with that familiar weight which suggests duty without ever becoming theatrical. Outside, St. Swithin's Lane is awake in its usual narrow way. Wheels pass with a sticky sound over damp mud. Porters carry parcels. A messenger boy pauses to stare at a brass plate as if it were a kind of oracle. The oddity is almost too neat. New Court has the air of the original institution with a credit rating better than most sovereign nations. Yet Parliament still cannot quite decide whether to issue it a membership pass. Lionel signs 3 letters before breakfast is mentioned. One concerns bullion, one concerns a railway account, one concerns a seat in the Commons that the voters have given him and the House still will not quite hand over. He takes his breakfast later than Charlotte likes and earlier than business prefers. There is coffee in a silver pot. There is toast cut thin. There is an egg whose shell cracks with a small dry sigh under the spoon. Charlotte hears the result in Piccadilly before he reaches the house. News travels there with the smooth speed of servants, cousins, and well-trained social currents. By the time Lionel arrives, flowers have already been moved to the right room. Her drawing rooms hold their own climate. Hothouse flowers send out a warm, sweet breath. Candle wax keeps a soft honey smell in the air. The carpet gives underfoot like something that has learned discretion. She asks only 2 questions. Who sent word first, and whether Lord So-and-so still prefers turtle soup to clear broth. Both questions matter. The second may matter slightly more before the evening is over. Charlotte has long understood a simple rule. The real legislation often begins over soup and continues through the fish. The bill may wear its official coat at Westminster, though its manners are usually taught at dinner. Footmen bring in folded cards and lay them on a side table. She studies names the way Lionel studies markets. One bishop goes near a Whig minister with a mild wife. Another peer must be placed where his hearing is better and his vanity well fed. Nothing in her face suggests strain. She has the serene air of a woman arranging flowers in a vase. It only happens that the flowers are cabinet men, bishops, cousins, and one novelist with a seat in Parliament. By afternoon, the carriage is ready for Westminster. The horse snorts a little cloud into the cool air. Lionel settles his hat and gloves. The leather seat has that polished firmness that gives no comfort and offers no apology. The Palace of Westminster receives him in its own steady manner. Stone holds the day's chill long after noon. Gas lamps hiss faintly. The oak panels seem to store old speeches in their grain and release none of them helpfully. The green benches glow under the lantern ceiling with a patient sort of brightness. Shoes scrape on the floor. Papers rustle. Somewhere a throat is cleared with the importance of a man preparing to be constitutional. At the entrance there is the doorkeeper. He has the grave, brushed look of a servant who has seen everything except a quiet day. He gives Lionel a small apologetic nod of professional recognition. It is no longer a nod of surprise. It is the nod of one patient man to another. He has now watched this same approach and retreat so often that routine has almost become companionship. Lionel goes to the bar of the house as he has before. The space is familiar now in the way a dentist's waiting room becomes familiar. One could sketch the place from memory and still not wish to linger. The clerk has the oath. The troublesome words remain where they always remain. They sit there in plain English with all the stubborn force of furniture too large for the doorway. Lionel will not say the Christian words. He cannot say them and keep faith with himself. So the deadlock appears again, neat and complete, like a machine that has been polished carefully and built for only one task. No one raises a sword over this matter. No one beats a drum. Britain prefers a nice thick layer of procedure over its absurdities, which gives them a decent finish and a remarkable staying power. He turns away as before. The doorkeeper gives that same slight nod. Behind him the chamber resumes its murmur with almost indecent calm, as if nothing more than a misplaced umbrella had been discussed. Back in the carriage the city looks entirely ordinary. Shop windows hold gloves and books. A woman lifts her skirt from the mud at a crossing. A dog trots beside a cart with more purpose than many constitutional debates. At New Court next morning the ledgers do not seem offended by Parliament. Figures line up obediently. Wax seals crack. The fire is made up again. Money, unlike the Constitution, generally knows what it is doing by 9:30. That contrast becomes part of the whole strange picture. Lionel can move funds across borders with a letter and a trusted name, yet to cross a few yards of oak floor to a bench in the Commons remains impossible. The city notices this with growing clarity. Merchants do not love muddle when it interferes with settled business, nor do they enjoy being told that their choice is admirable in theory and unusable in practice. So when another election comes, the meaning grows firmer. It is still a lawful poll with booths, papers, and the smell of damp coats. Yet it now carries the quiet firmness of a repeated instruction. In 1852, the morning begins under a low gray sky. Carriages leave wet half-moons on the street. Men shake umbrellas at doorways. Hats darken with mist and shine again by the fire inside. The city goes about the work with practical solemnity. Traders speak of votes between prices. Someone folds a newspaper under his arm beside a parcel of samples and a sandwich wrapped in paper. There is nothing grand in the act itself. A name is marked. A voter coughs. A pen scratches. Democracy often looks like waiting in a queue while trying not to step on someone else's boot. When the result comes, it has the feel of a bell struck again. Lionel is returned. The phrase seems simple, yet with each use, it becomes less a report and more a deliberate statement from the square mile. Newcourt receives that statement as it received the first. There are letters to answer. There are visitors to greet. One clerk drops a pen and blushes as if he had disturbed the Bank of England itself. Lionel removes his gloves finger by finger before sitting down. He lines them neatly beside the blotter. Small habits are a comfort. They place order on the desk, when order elsewhere remains under discussion. In the Commons, friends rise to argue the case again. Among them is Benjamin Disraeli, who brings to any room a great deal of language and at least two shadows of himself. One is warm, the other is calculating. He speaks with feeling about justice and fitness for office. He speaks beautifully about talent and loyalty to the nation. He does not sound false, which is the awkward part, because much of what he says is plainly sincere. Yet his support always seems to arrive in carefully measured portions. It is like a good but not generous serving of pudding. One is pleased to receive it, though one suspects there was more in the kitchen. Disraeli knows the subject brushes too near his own old story. He was born into one world and baptized into another. He can champion Jewish emancipation with grace, though not always with the reckless abandon of a man volunteering personal inconvenience. Lionel listens without any visible sign of irritation. He has long practice in patience. A banker learns early that motives are mixed in almost every serious transaction, and politics merely perfumes the fact with better phrases. Disraeli's sentences curl through the chamber with warm color. Members lean in. Some admire him. Some distrust him. Most do both at once, which is one of the usual services he provides to public life. Then the measure climbs the staircase toward the Lords. There it meets Lord Lyndhurst, elderly, alert, and beautifully prepared to object. He approaches each bill as though heaven invented constitutions, chiefly so he could defend their current arrangement. Lyndhurst does not say no in a rude way. He says it in a long, polished, fully furnished way. By the end, one has been denied with such ceremony that it almost feels like receiving an invitation. The House of Lords keeps up its exclusive velvet rope policy with much dignity. The gentlemen in ermine are not opposed to Jews in principle. They merely dislike the specific Jewish gentleman who keeps being elected in front of everyone. So the bill fails again, or stalls again, or dissolves into parliamentary weather. The exact form matters less each time. The result is the same old little wall built from ancient words and fresh speeches. Lionel returns to the bar of the House as before. The boards beneath his shoes do not creak any differently. The same formula waits. The same refusal follows. Repetition gives the whole business a slightly comic accuracy. The doorkeeper's nod is now almost an established custom. It is not warm enough to be friendship. It is something more English. It is a carefully limited human acknowledgement conducted under good discipline. The House seems nearly surprised by its own predictability. Gas lamps hiss. A page carries papers. Someone whispers. Lionel comes, declines, and goes. The institution performs the same steps like a clockwork toy in a frock coat. At Piccadilly, Charlotte keeps another dinner. She never speaks of it as a campaign, because that would make it sound too noisy. It is simply a meal with proper people, proper wines, and highly improper consequences for future votes. Servants lay cloth so smooth it could almost be water. Silver catches the candlelight and sends it back in soft shapes. In the hall, damp cloaks give off a smell of wool and winter air before they disappear upstairs. The first course is delicate enough to lower everyone's voice. Soup arrives in warmed plates. There may be clear broth with root vegetables cut very fine. There may be turtle, because one should never attempt reform on an empty sense of importance. Charlotte places a sympathetic minister beside a well-disposed bishop. She places a doubtful cousin near a woman who laughs softly and remembers names. She separates two peevish men with a floral centerpiece and 6 feet of polished mahogany. Lionel watches this from his place with quiet respect. He has moved money through Europe with less exact planning than Charlotte uses on a seating card. She can alter the temperature of a conversation by changing 2 names before noon. Nothing about the room feels like conspiracy. That would be too smoky and exciting. It feels like excellent housekeeping with a constitutional aftertaste. A bishop asks for more sauce. A minister admits something useful while praising the fish. Candles burn low and very straight in the still air. The flowers give off a soft green smell under the warmer scents from the table. A plate is changed with such skill that the guest barely notices his own previous dinner vanishing. Charlotte never hurries a point. She lets one man speak of trade. She lets another mention conscience. She allows a story about the city to become, very gently, a question about why its chosen member still waits outside. One bishop dabs his lips and says the case grows awkward. Another agrees that old forms can harden into odd shapes. A secretary to a minister studies his wine for a moment, with the face of a man discovering he has always believed this. After dinner, the ladies withdraw, and the men follow later, carrying their opinions with them like napkins half folded. In the drawing room, the air is sweeter, and the chairs are lower. Politics becomes milder in tone and often stronger in effect. Charlotte moves through that room with the lightest touch. She asks after a sister's cough. She recommends a flower grower. She says one plain sentence about fairness, and the sentence remains in the room long after the music has begun. Lionel sometimes wonders if Westminster ought simply to relocate to Piccadilly and save everyone time. Many laws would pass faster. Some would pass only after the second pudding. The kingdom has been steered by less sensible arrangements. Meanwhile, the public grows used to the rhythm. Lionel is elected. Lionel presents himself. Lionel cannot take the seat. Lionel is elected again. Even the newspapers begin to sound as though they are describing a familiar household appliance. That familiarity is powerful in its own slow way. A single refusal can be dismissed as a problem. 5 returns begin to resemble a principle. The city keeps clicking the confirmation button, and Parliament keeps pretending the page failed to load. On some mornings, Lionel folds those reports beside his breakfast plate. Marmalade glows amber on the toast rack. Coffee sends up steam. The silver knife rests across china, while another editorial explains why the obvious remains, regrettably, not yet convenient. He turns the page and reads on. His calm is not theatrical patience. It is the practical patience of a man who has learned that stubborn structures often outlast the first several arguments against them. In office, he attends to the usual stream of decisions. There are bonds to consider and letters from Paris. There are questions about shipments and signatures. Delay in one chamber does not stop the world from expecting answers elsewhere by luncheon. That very ordinariness strengthens the public case. Here is a man trusted with fortunes, correspondence, and national credit. Yet he is still held at the door of the legislature by a phrase and an oath that fits him poorly and fits the moment worse. A symbolic weight gathers in layers rather than leaps. A voter tells a friend at the coffee house. A merchant repeats the story over accounts. A cabman knows enough of it to shrug and say the city has chosen its man again. Even those who dislike change begin to tire of the loop. There is something exhausting about a constitutional puzzle that insists on solving itself and still must wait for permission. The thing becomes less alarming and more embarrassing. When another return to the house comes, Lionel knows each motion by feel. Hat in hand, papers ready, shoes on old boards. The doorkeepers nod, the little stillness before the words appear, exactly where they appeared last time. He could almost recite the whole scene by now, except for the bit he will not recite. The absurdity has become domestic. It is like a stair that always creaks on the third step. One stops being startled and begins resenting the carpentry. Lyndhurst remains ready in the Lords whenever needed. Age has not softened his appetite for this particular duty. He seems a man who has found in Jewish emancipation the perfect hobby, because it allows endless practice and very stately refusal. He speaks of constitutions and safeguards and delicate balances. He handles precedent as if it were fine china. One fears only that he enjoys washing and drying it so much that he cannot bear anyone to eat off it. Disraeli remains equally complicated. He offers handsome words when the case is heard. He can sound deeply moved by justice. Then he discovers some slight practical reason for caution, as if conviction must never arrive without a chaperone. Lionel does not make him simpler in private thought. He knows better. People rarely come in one piece, especially in public life. Disraeli is ally, rival, ornament, and warning, all in one carefully tied cravat. In 1857, the pattern has grown almost ceremonial. Posters appear, names are spoken, the city does what it has done before. Yet now each vote carries the weight of memory from all the votes that came earlier. By then, re-election no longer feels like a routine contest. It feels like a slow public essay written by thousands of hands. Each ballot adds another sentence saying that exclusion has become too strange to dress as common sense. Election day still looks very ordinary at street level. Men stamp their feet against the cold. Horses leave steaming piles that no one romanticizes. A seller of buns calls out nearby, because history is all very well, but people must eat. The city's choice comes in with steady force. Lionel is returned yet again. Nothing in the words has changed. Everything in their meaning has deepened. A repeated fact can become an argument if repeated long enough. At New Court, the clerks continue their work under the lamps. One trims a pen with a small knife. Another sands a signature. The whole building hums with exactness, as if efficiency itself had rented rooms off the ling. There is a quiet pleasure in such rooms. Ledger paper has a firm, dry feel under the hand. The desks hold little kingdoms of sealing wax, knives, twine, and folded notes. Outside politics may dawdle. Inside, noon arrives, and tasks are done. That contrast now carries its own public lesson. New Court had effectively bankrolled half the age and much of the building across the river. Yet its master still could not secure an approved seat there without a special adjustment in wording. At Piccadilly, the dinners go on with patient regularity. Charlotte orders another evening that looks social and behaves political. The menu is discussed as seriously as a dispatch. The right claret can lubricate an argument better than many pamphlets. There is fish with a pale sauce and small potatoes turned smooth. There is saddle of mutton with winter greens. There is a pudding that persuades one elderly churchman to remain in his chair long enough to hear a very useful observation. Charlotte listens more than she speaks. She tilts her head when a guest reveals an uncertainty. She answers with a story, a question, or another spoonful offered at exactly the right moment. She would have made an alarming field marshal. Lionel sees ministers thaw by the second course. He sees bishops grow almost practical over dessert. One man arrives certain that the issue is impossible. He leaves discussing which precise form of words might make the impossible merely late. These evenings never feel hurried. Servants move lightly. Glass rings once on silver. A clock ticks in the next room. Reform in Charlotte's hands proceeds at the pace of excellent service and very good digestion. The public notices her less than it should. Drawing rooms leave fewer records than speeches, yet many a solemn view at Westminster has first been softened in Piccadilly by warm candle wax, hothouse flowers, and the discovery that a feared change might actually be manageable. Lionel ends many nights tired in an ordinary way. He sits by the fire with his shoes off, stockings warm at the grate. A servant sets down a tray with broth or tea, because even constitutional symbols need supper. He is not a dramatic sufferer. He does not brood beneath portraits or curse the age. He rubs the bridge of his nose, asks after the children, and remarks that the Lords remain very firm on preserving the past from the elected present. There is humor in that, though a dry kind. The chamber that rejects him is not denying his existence or his wealth or his usefulness. It is merely denying, with great refinement, the final administrative step. So the years teach the country by repetition. Each election strips away another excuse. Each return to the bar of the House makes the contradiction easier to see. Each dinner at Piccadilly oils one more hinge in one more cautious mind. The constitutional argument becomes almost visible in the air of London. It hangs over coffee cups and carriage rugs. It drifts through counting houses and club windows. It settles on the green benches under the hiss of gas lamps. Lionel keeps presenting himself because that is the plainest available proof. The city keeps sending him because it knows persistence can become eloquent. A nation that prides itself on forms sometimes needs the same form repeated until its absurdity goes dull and obvious. By the end of these years, the whole business has a strange settled shape. The doorkeeper nods. The oath waits. The city chooses again. Charlotte lays another table. Disraeli produces another speech with feeling trimmed to fit circumstance. Nothing is resolved in a burst. The matter ripens instead. It sits in the public mind like fruit left on a shelf where everyone passes daily. At first it is noticed, then it is expected, then it is plainly ready. And Lionel, patient in his coat and gloves, remains the same calm figure near the chamber door. He is still, just outside the room he has every right to enter. The repeated elections have turned that doorway itself into the argument. In the oak chill of Westminster, Lionel de Rothschild learned the grain of waiting. The gas lamps hissed softly above him. The green benches glowed under the lantern ceiling. The air held damp wool, old paper, and the faint soot of London carried in on coats. He stood near the bar of the House with his hat in his hand. His gloves were neat and pale. His coat sat well across the shoulders. Nothing in his dress suggested haste or temper or even the least wish to disturb a room. A clerk held out the book for the oath. It was a Hebrew Bible, dark with use and smooth at the edges. The leather had the soft shine of something handled often. The pages made a thin, dry sound as they shifted under careful fingers. The words waited in their usual order. They moved toward the place where a Christian phrase still sat like an unwanted footstool. Lionel stopped where he always stopped. He declined where he always declined. Then he bowed and withdrew with exact politeness. It was a fine art by then. He made no scene at all. He simply let the scene belong to the room, which was somehow more awkward for everyone else. The doorkeeper knew the pattern almost as well as Lionel did. He had now seen this little walk begin and end enough times to file it mentally with the palace clocks. He gave Lionel a small apologetic nod. It was the nod of one patient man to another. The odd thing was that the rest of Lionel's life remained busy in a perfectly ordinary way. At New Court in St. Swithin's Lane, quill pens kept scratching. Coal fires kept the counting rooms warm. Good leather and beeswax held their calm smell over the ledgers and the tall desks. Morning there began with papers, not principles. Clerks shook rain from hats in the passage. Sand was tapped over fresh ink to dry it. A messenger arrived with a sealed note, while another left with one tucked inside his coat. The House was lending to governments before breakfast had settled properly. Railway paper lay in one stack, foreign bonds lay in another. A visitor could hear Europe rearranging itself into columns and totals, while the office clock ticked like a stern ant. It was, as London understood perfectly well, the original institution with a credit standing better than many kingdoms. That this same House could not obtain a proper membership pass for a building it had effectively helped to bankroll. Even history sometimes misplaced its visitor badge. The joke was too tidy to ignore. In 1847, the City of London had chosen Lionel for Parliament. The choice was not shy or uncertain. The city knew exactly whom it wanted. Merchants and traders had looked at the matter with practical eyes and clicked the confirmation button in the Victorian manner, using ballots and a great deal of patience. He was not a man who needed a title to feel important. He was already head of the London House. He already moved great sums with a few lines of ink. He already dined with ministers who knew very well whose carriage had arrived outside. But a seat was a seat. It belonged to the voters who sent him there. It belonged to the ordinary rules of representation. And there he was, elected cleanly, standing just outside the door like a perfectly respectable umbrella denied entry to its own stand. The Commons, for its part, could see the absurdity quite plainly. Members spoke for relief more than once. Bills were drafted with care. They passed through the elected chamber and session after session, with the steady feeling of men doing a task that should already have been finished. Then the matter went upstairs. The House of Lords maintained history's most exclusive velvet rope policy with great composure. The ermine was excellent. The welcome was less so. Lord Lyndhurst became the most reliable blocking device in the building. He was old, clever, and tireless in the special way of men who have found a subject that makes them feel brisk again. He drew fresh reasons from the Constitution as if from a deep sideboard drawer. There always seemed to be one more folded objection inside. His speeches were long and grave. They had all the right furniture. Principle stood in one corner. Precedent stood in another. Ancient danger was polished and set on the mantelpiece, although no one could quite say when it had last been used. The result remained wonderfully consistent. A bill would pass the Commons. It would travel upward with decent hopes. Then it would expire among red benches, respectful phrases, and a quantity of noble concern that never seemed to improve anything. By the early 1850s, the rhythm had become almost domestic. The Commons sent another measure. The Lords killed it again. Lionel approached the bar, declined the Christian words, bowed and left as if returning an item to a shop that still insisted on the wrong receipt. Then the City of London repeated itself. At the next election, it chose him again. And later, it chose him again. The voters were not subtle, but on this point, subtlety would only have wasted everyone's time. That repeated choice mattered more than a single speech. Each fresh election rubbed the same fact into the grain of public life. He had been sent. He remained unsworn. The obstacle was no longer mysterious, only visible. Lionel seems from a distance almost too calm for the story, yet his calm was part of the method. He did not offer Westminster the pleasure of outrage. He let it look at its own arrangements until those arrangements began to look silly without assistance. This required a certain daily discipline. Patience is easier as a word than as a habit. It means dressing carefully to be refused carefully. It means carrying dignity in public like a folded overcoat through weather that never quite decides. On those mornings he crossed into the palace with the same measured pace. Boots tapped on stone. A servant opened one door and then another. Somewhere, a distant voice rose and fell in debate over some entirely different business, because government is very good at having several muddles at once. The house itself had its own small weather. Lantern lights sat over the chamber in a mellow haze. The benches held a smell of polished wood and wool cloth warmed by many bodies. Papers rustled like dry leaves in a garden where no one was ever quite allowed to finish raking. Lionel's hat stayed in his hand. That detail mattered. It gave the moment an air of form rather than rebellion. A gentleman had come properly dressed, properly elected, and properly ready, which left very little for the room to complain of, except its own wording. The Hebrew Bible was presented with solemn exactness. It did not create a scene by itself. It simply sat there in plain view. That quiet object, with its familiar binding and modest weight, made the whole dispute look both ancient and oddly small. Then came the familiar point of refusal. No raised voice followed it. No grand flourish came after. There was only a brief halt, a few words, a bow, and the soft retreat of steps on the floorboards. Sometimes repetition strips dignity from an act. In Lionel's case, repetition added to it. Each return made him look steadier. Each refusal made the system look more fussy. Like a clerk who keeps sending back the same form because the date sits in the wrong square. Outside Westminster, business stayed magnificently unruffled. At New Court, the ledgers grew fat in all the usual places. Figures were copied into neat columns. Wax seals cooled on folded letters, while young clerks hurried past with bundles hugged to the chest. The counting house had a warmth unlike that of drawing rooms. It came from coal, from work, and from close human attention. Good leather chairs took the weight of men, who leaned back for a moment, and then forward again. The wax surfaces of desks caught a dull shine from the windows. A visitor might hear French in one room and German in another. Messengers asked for signatures. Partners compared rates. Someone opened a map with a dry crackle and put a fingertip on a line where a new railway hoped to become inevitable. Lunch there was rarely theatrical. There might be cold beef, bread, and a glass of claret. There might be soup in a covered tureen if the day had turned raw. There were also apples in a bowl, because even great banking houses are still places where someone remembers fruit. Lionel moved through these rooms without visible strain. He read, dictated, listened, and signed. He glanced at totals that could make smaller institutions faint politely into the carpet. Then he reached for the next paper, as if sovereign debt were merely another caller waiting in the hall. There was comfort in the scale of this ordinary power. The office knew what it was doing. The partners knew their habits. The clerks knew which drawer held fresh quills and which cupboard held the clean glasses for visitors. One could almost forget Parliament there. Almost, but not quite. Letters still came from friends in the house. Newspapers still folded themselves around the question. Every few months the old subject returned, like a draft from a window that had never been properly fitted. Benjamin Disraeli entered this long tale in his own satin way. He spoke warmly for Jewish relief, and often beautifully. Then he found reasons why the moment, or the method, or the management might perhaps be improved by a little more delay. He was a genuinely moving ally with a cautious hand on the brake. He was, in short, eloquently complicated. It is hard to be the champion of a cause that keeps reminding the room of your own past paperwork. He could glow on the subject and still leave it gently cooling on the table. This was almost a talent of its own. Lionel did not seem surprised by him. He had spent too long among public men to demand tidy souls from them. If support arrived in a mixed parcel, one still opened the parcel. The ribbon did not have to match the box. Charlotte understood that principle even better. At the Piccadilly house, her drawing room smelled of hothouse flowers and warm candle wax. Servants moved quietly over thick carpets. Chairs were set just so, because furniture can advance a policy if placed with enough care. She ran dinners with serene exactness. One minister found himself beside one bishop. One editor found himself across from one merchant whose views were becoming usefully modern. The soup arrived at the right heat, and opinion softened with it. Charlotte had long grasped a fact that Westminster preferred to ignore. The real legislation often happened over the soup course. It happened between a second glass of claret and the fish. It happened while someone reached for the salt and admitted, in a lower voice, that the whole business had become rather embarrassing. Her tables were handsome, but never merely showy. Silver reflected the candlelight in small moons. Napkins lay thick and folded. There might be turtle soup, or clear broth with little dumplings, or a white fish with a clean sauce that offended nobody. Lionel, in those rooms, did not need to push hard. He only needed to be present. He needed to look as he always looked, capable and unruffled. It is difficult to maintain that a man is unfit for public life while borrowing his salt under his own roof. Beyond London, the country calendar kept its faithful pace. There were Sundays at Gunnersbury Park. There were drives, picnics, and measured walks over the lawns. There was the odd comfort of seeing large political questions pass briefly beneath the shade of ordinary trees. Gunnersbury had its own soft order. Blankets were spread, baskets were opened, cold chicken, ham, bread, fruit, and little cakes appeared in an arrangement that suggested abundance without any need to boast. Children ran where adults preferred to stroll. Ladies adjusted bonnets against the light. A servant uncorked something cool. Bees moved in the flower beds with the air of creatures who had never heard of parliamentary disabilities and considered themselves much the happier for it. Lionel was not always talking politics there. He might watch the grass bend under a mild wind. He might ask after a cousin, a horse, or the state of a road. A family day has ways of making even a famous banker seem mostly like a man deciding whether to have another slice of pie. There were also visits to Newmarket. The racecourse had its own kind of ritual, less solemn and more dusty. Boots picked up chalk and grass, glasses flashed in the sun, men with excellent waistcoats developed instant opinions about horses they had met only at a distance. Society ran on these habits as surely as law did. Country houses filled and emptied by season, invitations crossed in the post. Train times improved things while also making everyone feel rushed in a novel and unnecessary manner. All through these years, the Jewish question sat inside that social world like an extra place laid at table. Not every host mentioned it. Not every guest wished to. Yet it hovered near the decanter, waiting politely until someone asked whether the present arrangement could really be defended much longer. Many answered with a soft sort of no. They were not radicals. They still valued form and order and proper sequence. They had simply reached the point where the exclusion of Lionel de Rothschild seemed less like principle and more like a habit that had outlived its furniture. That change was Lionel's real progress. He did not batter the door. He stood at it so steadily that the door itself began to look foolish. There are institutions that survive attack very well and survive laughter rather badly. The doorkeeper noticed public moods before newspapers did. Faces changed. The little nod he gave Lionel grew warmer over the years. A man who watches traffic at a doorway develops strong private views about who ought to be let through. Perhaps he counted the attempts, perhaps he did not, but he had seen hat in hand, Bible presented, refusal made, and departure repeated often enough to feel that the palace itself should have learned something by now. The Commons certainly tried to teach it. 1 year brought one bill, another year brought another. Sometimes the measure was broad and meant for all Jews. Sometimes it narrowed itself to oath words and practical fixes, as if trimming the cloth might tempt the lords to accept the coat. The lords, however, kept finding a loose thread to pull. Lord Lyndhurst did this with immense concentration. He could oppose a small amendment with the grave care other men gave to cathedral repairs. One almost had to admire the stamina, while wishing he had taken up gardening instead. He was never careless with language. That was part of the trouble. Blunt prejudice can be answered in a day. Elegant obstruction arrives dressed for dinner and lingers through dessert. So the years arrange themselves into a quiet cycle. Election, bill, debate, refusal, return, another election, another bill. The calendar pages turned with the calm efficiency of a household account book, while one constitutional absurdity remained penciled stubbornly in the margin. By 1857, this pattern was famous enough to seem nearly official. The city sent Lionel again. Westminster received the news with the same old stiffness. The country had now watched the same democratic fact presented often enough that denial began to feel like a children's game played by elderly men in ermine. New Court still opened on time each morning. Fires were laid before the clerks arrived. Inkstands were filled. Ledgers waited with blank lines that would soon no longer be blank, because money has no patience for constitutional embarrassment. News from Paris or Vienna came folded thin and fast. Exchange rates shifted by noon. A courier brought rumors that required 3 calm men and 1 sharp pencil. Tea was poured in cups that cooled untouched beside columns of figures. Lionel sat at the center of this with his usual self-command. He knew how to separate what could be altered from what had to ripen. A government bond might move in an afternoon. A national habit might need 11 years and a wife with an excellent guest list. At home, Charlotte kept that guest list in elegant motion. Cards were answered. Men who seldom agreed found themselves invited together. Someone always happened to discover that Lionel was not a symbol at all, but a host who asked sensible questions and remembered the names of sons at school. That kind of knowledge changes politics by inches. A minister leaves dinner less afraid of a category once he has eaten asparagus beside it. A bishop becomes more flexible after poached salmon and a very decent pudding. The human race is noble in parts, but it is also very much ruled by chairs and gravy. In the drawing room after dinner, the talk often softened. Candles burned lower. Coffee cups clicked gently on saucers. A lady turned pages at the piano while the men rediscovered their moral courage in the pleasant afterglow of hospitality. Charlotte did not press. She arranged, she placed. She let the room do what rooms can do when they are lit kindly and supplied with competent cake. It was politics in kid gloves, which are often the strongest sort. Lionel's own part remained the same. He did not complain publicly in bitter tones. He did not threaten to withdraw from public life. He presented himself as ready, lawful, and available, which left the exclusion resting wholly on those who maintained it. This was not passive. It was active patience, which costs more. It meant showing up again when showing up had become almost comic. It meant trusting that steady fact can wear down old nonsense like water wearing stone, though with much better tailoring. Even the newspapers began to enjoy the shape of the absurdity. There was something irresistible in the picture. Here stood one of the most powerful men in British finance, elected by the first commercial constituency in the kingdom, still unable to clear a verbal hurdle placed before him by gentlemen who borrowed money with perfect freedom. He became, in modern terms, a verified account that Parliament still refused to approve. The seal was there. The public could see it. Yet the platform continued to ask for one more impossible checkbox. Still he kept his face composed. That composure mattered because it denied the opposition a useful picture. There was no dangerous outsider storming the chamber. There was only Lionel de Rothschild, neat as ever, presenting a Bible, and then being sent away by wording. Words, after all, were the hinge. The oath ended with a Christian declaration. Lionel could not honestly speak it. The state, with immense effort, pretended not to understand that honesty was the reason he ought to be trusted. That point slowly entered common sense. One did not need to love reform to see it. One simply needed to notice that a man willing to stop at false words was probably not the greatest threat to public order. Indeed, he looked rather refreshingly safe. When debates resumed, the chamber held all its usual sounds. Coughs appeared in clusters, boots shifted on the floor, papers were turned over with the faint irritation of men who knew the arguments by heart, but still intended to make them. Disraeli gave support in tones as rich as plum jam. He could praise justice, history, and national honor within a few polished minutes. Then, almost as if tidying the silver, he might introduce some delicate note of timing or method that prevented enthusiasm from becoming anything as rash as completion. Lord Lyndhurst answered with seasoned grandeur. He had one more constitutional concern, then another, then perhaps a final one, followed by a supplementary concern that had just occurred to him with suspicious convenience. Lionel did not need to answer each point himself. His silence had become eloquent in its own plain way. He let the pile of objections grow. A large pile can eventually topple under its own excellent arrangement. Meanwhile, London's seasons went on. There were mornings of fog on the streets near St. Swithin's Lane. There were bright afternoons in Hyde Park. There were evenings when carriage lamps floated through Piccadilly like warm stars carrying gossip from one drawing room to another. Life is full of things that insist on continuing. Laundry had to be aired, boots had to be brushed, soup had to be made, and there is comfort in remembering that even constitutional history advances partly on broth. At Gunnersbury, the lawns never hurried. Garden chairs sank a little into the grass, napkins lifted in a light breeze. Someone laughed at a child, or at a dog, or at an aunt who had brought far too many shawls for weather that had no intention of turning cold. Those Sundays steadied the years. A family could eat under trees, while the House of Lords perfected its refusal indoors. The strawberries were no less ripe for that. The tea was no less welcome. There is a kind of strength in keeping ordinary pleasures on schedule. It tells the world that obstruction has not become the center of things. It says, very softly, that one can be excluded from a chamber without being excluded from life. By the later 1850s, that message had sunk in widely. Lionel's exclusion no longer made him look marginal. It made Parliament look outdated. The institution had kept him at the threshold so long that the threshold itself had started to seem like a museum display. Even some defenders of the old rule grew tired. Fatigue is underrated in politics. People will resist an argument for years and then abandon it because they are bored of hearing themselves make it. Reform sometimes arrives not in a blaze, but in a yawn. In 1858, the shape of the solution finally altered. Instead of waiting for one grand settlement to please every conscience at once, Parliament moved toward a practical arrangement. Each house would manage the oath in its own way. It was less majestic than years of speechifying had promised, and therefore much more useful. When Lionel came again, the scene was familiar almost to the point of tenderness. The chamber still smelled of wood and wool. The officials still knew their places. The book was still brought forward with due care. This time the wording bent. The House of Commons allowed the Christian phrase to be omitted for him. After 11 years at the threshold, the mechanism finally chose sense over habit. One can be very lofty for a long while, and then suddenly decide to act like a clerk with a practical pen. Lionel took the oath as he could honestly take it. There was no thunder attached to the moment. No architectural shaking occurred. The ceiling remained where it had always been, which must have disappointed a few prophets of doom. Then he took his seat. That was all, in one sense. A man sat down where his voters had long ago sent him. The great constitutional mountain had turned out to contain, at its center, a chair. The doorkeeper, one likes to think, approved. He had seen enough of the old performance. He had given enough small nods in the passage. At last he could watch Lionel pass the point of refusal and continue inside, which must have felt like a clock finally striking the right hour. Back at New Court, the pens kept scratching as before. Ledgers opened, letters were sealed, Europe continued to require loans with undiminished appetite, and the House of Rothschild continued to provide them with composed efficiency. At Piccadilly, Charlotte still arranged her tables. Flowers still gave off their warm hothouse scent. Soup still worked quiet wonders between one course and the next. Politics still improved when seated beside fish and followed by pudding. And Lionel himself remained much as he had been through the long delay. He was patient. He was exact. He had spent 11 years turning exclusion into an image so calm and so stubbornly reasonable that the country could finally see the joke was on the gatekeepers. That may be the strangest comfort in this long episode. The man kept outside never became smaller. He simply stood there, hat in hand, until the doorway looked absurd around him. Then at last, he walked through as if arriving only a little late for a meeting he had always intended to attend. The morning paper lay open on Lionel de Rothschild's desk at New Court. The room held its usual warm smell of good leather and beeswax. Quill pens scratched in the outer office with the steady patience of rain. A clerk had set the sheets square to the blotter. The blue sand shaker stood near the inkwell. A paper knife of dull silver rested on the margin, as neat as a small ruler. Lionel read with his hands quiet on the desk. He did not lean back. He did not drum his fingers. He had the still look of a man who had spent many years letting public life catch up with private certainty. By the windows, the July light came in soft and dusty. Ledger backs glowed red and brown along the shelves. Now and then a carriage rolled over the stones in St. Swithin's Lane with a sound like crockery being moved carefully. The news itself was not magical. It was merely political. In London, that was often enough. A ministry had changed. The old one had gone out. The new one had come in with the usual air of men discovering that chairs look simpler from across the room. That shift mattered because governments carry moods as well as papers. A tired house may refuse one thing for years. Then one spring it develops an appetite for being sensible, provided the sense arrives in a respectable coat. The Lords had also altered by degrees. A death here mattered, an absence there mattered. One or two men had grown bored of repeating the same great refusal in slightly different Latin. No one announced this as a revolution. It was more like a dining room after guests have changed seats. The talk stayed polite, yet the whole table behaved differently. Charlotte understood such changes better than most cabinet ministers. In Piccadilly, under the scent of hothouse flowers and warm candle wax, she had long arranged her dinners with the calm skill of a practiced card dealer. She could place a bishop beside a merchant as if moving salt and pepper. She could put exactly the right minister next to exactly the right man of feeling before the soup arrived. The soup then did a surprising amount of constitutional work. Lionel never pretended that dinners alone remade the law. He knew too much about votes, papers, and old habits. Still, a good turtle soup could soften a principle that had gone crusty at the edges. The paper in front of him described the new arrangements with proper seriousness. Names moved into office, names moved out. Small phrases hinted that the fresh ministry might prefer a settlement to another season of theatrical resistance. It was not that every man had grown enlightened overnight. Such events are mostly harder and duller than that. Many had simply grown practical, which in public business is nearly as useful. Lord Derby's government had not entered office to become a choir of pure conviction. It had entered office to govern. Governing often leads sensible men toward compromise in the same way cold weather leads them toward a fire. Across the room, a clerk turned a page in a ledger. The paper gave a dry rustle. Someone in the hall coughed into a folded handkerchief and then thought better of coughing again. Lionel read on. He had been elected for the City of London often enough to know the shape of delay by touch. Parliament had clicked the confirmation button for him 5 separate times and still failed to issue the final pass. He folded one corner of the sheet. He reached for the next report. He looked exactly like a banker checking grain prices in Antwerp. The old obstacle was still there in words. The oath required a Christian ending. The law had kept that small gate shut with the stubborn energy of a lock that has outlived the door. For 11 years, bills had gone up to the Lords and been turned back with powdered courtesy. The process had become almost domestic in its regularity. One could have set the season by it, like asparagus. Lord Lyndhurst had long served as the chamber's most polished blocking device. He approached each Jewish bill with the grave concentration of a man who had at last found his favorite hobby. That hobby was saying no in the finest constitutional language available. He was not alone, of course. The House of Lords had become history's most exclusive velvet rope. The gentlemen in ermine wished it noted that they objected to no one in principle, only to the specific men repeatedly chosen by voters. This year, however, the mechanism had slipped a little. The numbers were not quite the same. The feeling was not quite the same. Even opposition can grow tired of hearing its own best lines. Men who had once resisted on broad grounds now looked for narrower ground. Men who had once liked the broad language of principle began to ask whether a clever device might save everyone's face. Public virtue often enjoys a side door. That side door arrived in the shape of Lord Lucan's amendment. It was not grand. It was not ringing. It had the modest look of something designed by a man who liked hinges. The proposal said that each house might settle the form of its own oath. That was all. The kingdom did not tilt on its axis. A great problem simply received a practical sentence and a useful set of brackets. Lionel read the wording twice. It had the dry taste of parliamentary print, which is to say, it looked dull and did important work. He knew at once what it offered and what it avoided. It did not proclaim a sweeping new doctrine from the rooftops. It did not ask every peer to fall in love with emancipation before breakfast. It merely let the Commons order its own threshold and stop borrowing the Lord's doormat. That narrowness helped it. Broad principle can alarm a room. A measured housekeeping change can pass, while everyone is still straightening the teaspoons. One could almost hear the sigh behind the amendment. If the houses could each decide their own form, then the Lords might cease blocking the Commons on behalf of the Commons. Even old institutions enjoy fewer chores. A messenger came in with another bundle of papers tied in tape. He set them down with care. Lionel moved his blotter a little to the left, making room without lifting his eyes. He had spent long years around men who spoke as if no compromise could be honorable. In banking, such men usually wished someone else to carry the risk. In politics, they often wished someone else to carry the embarrassment. Lucan's device carried both in tidy portions. The Lords could say they had yielded no universal point. The Commons could then do what the city had already asked them to do again and again. Disraeli had supported relief in speeches warm enough to heat a corridor. Then he had sometimes discovered small reasons not to hurry quite so much. He remained an eloquently complicated ally, like a handsome umbrella that opens beautifully after the rain. Lionel did not waste emotion on this. Public life offered every variety of half-help. A man learned to accept assistance, even when it arrived dressed as hesitation. At New Court, practical thought moved faster than resentment. The place had a credit worth more than many governments, yet it still lacked a proper entry card for the chamber it had effectively helped finance. London could be almost sweet in its absurdities. By afternoon, reports from Westminster grew firmer. The Commons had taken the measure in hand with the air of men revisiting familiar furniture. Most of them knew exactly where every table stood and exactly who had stubbed a toe on it last year. There was debate because there is always debate. There were speeches with feeling and speeches with care. Yet the great astonishment was how ordinary the business seemed after 11 years of knocking. In the oak-paneled chill of the Palace of Westminster, gas lamps hissed under the lantern ceiling. Green benches held their old wool smell. Papers lay stacked in little drifts, each one claiming to be indispensable. Lionel was not in the chamber for all of this. He knew too well the shape of that threshold. He had approached the bar, declined the Christian words, and withdrawn again often enough for the doorkeeper to greet him with a small professional sadness. The doorkeeper had become a kind of quiet witness. He had seen Lionel repeat the same courteous refusal more times than he had enjoyed a hot dinner in peace. Their exchanged nod belonged to the patient brotherhood of men delayed by procedure. The Commons division came and carried the measure once more. The majority was solid enough to feel like habit. Members walked through the lobbies, counted themselves, and emerged to discover that arithmetic had continued behaving like arithmetic. No one fainted, no ceiling cracked. Clerks made their marks with the same ink as usual. Then the bill moved where so many of its elder cousins had gone to die politely. It passed to the Lords. Men waited to see whether the old Red Chamber would once again discover a grave reason to keep the same door shut. The compromise gave careful men a careful place to stand. It was narrow enough for conservatives and useful enough for everyone who wished the business ended before the leaves fell. The Lords debated it in their rich, slow manner. They took hold of words as if testing silver for weight. Yet the numbers, when they came, were no longer arranged for refusal. The amendment carried, the bill carried. The margin was not lavish, but it was sufficient, which is the most beautiful kind of majority when one has waited 11 years. One report reached New Court, folded into a hand so many times that its corners had turned soft. Another arrived in the evening papers. Both said much the same thing in slightly different clothes. The Jewish Disabilities Removal Act had passed. The law had bent at last. It had merely admitted, in a tone of strained reasonableness, that repeated elections ought perhaps to mean something. The act itself was a practical little instrument. Each house could now settle its own oath. The Commons soon chose to let a Jewish member omit the Christian phrase, which was the entire point dressed in modest tailoring. Lionel finished reading and placed the paper flat upon the desk. He did not call for champagne. He did not make a speech to the clerks. He asked instead for dates, notices, and the expected order of business for the following week. That was his way. Triumph, if it wished to be useful, had to learn bookkeeping. There would be forms. There would be messages to answer. There would be a proper coat to brush and a carriage to time against the city traffic. A junior clerk stood waiting with a notebook. Lionel gave 2 short instructions and 1 correction. The correction concerned an address line, which is often how history discovers its true size. He asked when the Commons would settle the exact form. He asked what hour would be best for arrival. He asked whether the carriage should go by way of Cheapside or thread the narrower streets. The clerk wrote each point carefully. His pen squeaked on a fresh nib. A little curl of paper came off where he pressed too hard at the turn of a letter. In Piccadilly that evening, Charlotte took the news with the serenity of a woman who had already planned 3 dinners beyond it. Candle wax warmed in the drawing rooms. Flowers from the hothouse gave off that faint wet sweetness that always suggested patient money. She did not say that she had expected this all along. That would have been vulgar. She merely asked who must be seen before Monday, and whether one troublesome gentleman should be placed by a bishop or by the fish. Lionel smiled in the small inward way that hardly moved his mouth. He preferred facts to celebration. Still, he knew the campaign had not been fought only in print and debate. Some of it had indeed been won over soup, claret, and careful seating plans. There was also, beneath the calm, a private amusement. New Court, that grave machine of credit and confidence, had spent years being treated like a trusted sovereign, while its head remained unlicensed to sit in a room full of borrowers. The age could be wonderfully untidy. The next days passed in the manner of all important days. They filled themselves with ordinary tasks. Letters required answers. Black coats needed brushing. People who had never hurried before suddenly discovered the charm of prompt congratulations. More than one note arrived from men who had opposed relief with measured conviction. Their wording now suggested that events had matured in exactly the direction they had always privately preferred. Time is very kind to memory. Lionel accepted these offerings with perfect ease. He had no use for collecting little debts of pride. He had waited too long to spend the first week on the pleasure of being right. At New Court, business remained dense and comforting. Clerks came in with bundles tied by string. Wax seals snapped. The room smelled of paper, dust, leather, and the faint metallic tang of fresh coins somewhere deeper in the house. Visitors were shown in, bowed, and sat. They spoke of railways, loans, and the market with the grave faces men reserve for numbers they hope will seem larger. Then, almost as an afterthought, they offered congratulations on Parliament. Lionel received both kinds of business in the same chair. He listened with the same attention. One matter concerned millions and the other an oath, yet he treated each as another item to be settled before luncheon. If he felt surprise, he wore none of it. The law had only arrived where the facts had stood for years. The city had sent him often enough that the eventual result resembled an overdue clerk more than a miracle. By the weekend, the form was fixed. The Commons would permit him to omit the Christian words. That simple adjustment, small on paper and enormous in practice, was ready to be used by the man it had chiefly been made for. The knowledge sat lightly in the house. Nobody paced. Nobody rehearsed speeches. A servant laid out linen with the same care as on any other Sunday night. The quiet morning came with a mild July light over London. It touched the window glass without glare. In the bedroom, the washstand smelled faintly of soap and cool water from the ewer. Lionel rose at his usual hour. He had slept well enough, which was perhaps the most eloquent comment available. Great public changes are best met after an ordinary night's rest. His shirt lay folded and aired. The linen felt crisp and dry against his hands. He put his arms into the sleeves with the slow exactness of a man who disliked beginning any day in a tangle. A servant brought hot water for shaving. The brush made a soft circular sound in the bowl. Steel touched the strop with that whispering scrape which seems much louder in a still room. He dressed in dark clothes suited to the house and to himself. The waistcoat buttons went in one by one. His watch chain settled across the front, with a small bright curve like a line drawn by habit. On the chair stood his coat, already brushed. The black cloth held hardly any lint. One cuff needed the lightest touch from a sleeve brush, which the servant supplied with the solemn care of a man assisting constitutional progress through grooming. Socks, shoes, neckcloth, gloves, each thing arrived in its turn. Each thing required a short pause and a practiced hand. Breakfast waited downstairs with the pleasant restraint of a good household. Tea steamed in a silver pot. There was toast under a folded napkin, a dish of eggs, and marmalade glowing dark in the morning light. Lionel ate without haste. A knife tapped once against porcelain. From farther down the room came the softened clink of another cup being set into its saucer. Charlotte joined him for part of the meal. She wore morning silk that moved with a dry rustle when she sat. Her questions were few and practical, which was one of the many reasons he loved her. She asked whether the papers had sent men to wait outside. She asked whether the carriage should stop at the usual entrance. She observed with mild satisfaction that one particularly solemn lord would now have to discover a new subject. Lionel answered in the same key. The papers could wait if they wished. The carriage would do as planned. As for solemn lords, London had an endless supply and need not fear a shortage. The house had fully woken. Footsteps sounded in the passage. A servant adjusted the hall runner. Somewhere deeper in the kitchen wing, a lid met a pan with a tidy ring. Outside, the street carried that mixed London smell of horse, damp stone, and coal smoke, kept at a polite distance by summer air. Wheels passed. Hooves struck the ground in patient pairs. The carriage stood ready. Its brass had been polished. The horses, very nearly as experienced in routine as their passenger, gave small motions of head and flank, while the coachman settled the reins. Lionel took his hat and gloves. He checked once for papers. He did not check again. The ride westward moved through streets already busy with trade. Shop fronts were opening. Porters bent under loads that looked impossible, until one remembered how often men do impossible things before 10 o'clock. At New Court he stopped first, because habit is stronger than ceremony. The counting house greeted him with its familiar warmth and its faithful smell of wax, leather, and ink. History, for a few minutes more, had to wait outside while the morning correspondence was sorted. He glanced through the first letters and signed what needed signing. One note concerned exchange rates. Another concerned a dinner. A third offered congratulations phrased with such care that it seemed to have worn gloves. Only then did he rise to leave for Westminster. That small delay pleased him. The house might at last be ready to receive him, but New Court remained the true center of his daily weather. As he stepped out again, one could have mistaken the day for any other Monday. That was part of its charm. Great changes often prefer ordinary coats. At the Palace of Westminster the air felt cooler. Stone held the night's chill in its seams. Gas lamps still hissed faintly in the passages where daylight had not yet fully settled. The doorkeeper saw him and gave that same apologetic nod, though today it carried a shade of relief. After so many repetitions, even a man of doors can grow attached to an ending. There were papers to sign and forms to observe. Clerks moved him through the steps with composed efficiency. The House had at last approved the verified account, after a notably long review process and several unnecessary requests for the same identity. When the moment came, Lionel took the oath in the form now allowed. The omitted words remained omitted. The sky again stayed where it was. Then he entered as a properly seated member for the City of London. The green bench had the same wool look as before. The chamber smelled of paper, wood, and the faint stale edge of many men enclosed with opinions. He sat down without flourish. He had spent 11 years getting to that simple action. It was in the end only a man taking his place on a bench. That plainness suited him. The business of a constitution is to make large questions end in small motions. A hand signs, a voice speaks, a man sits where the voters sent him. Around him the House continued in its usual way. Papers changed hands, a member coughed, someone farther off rustled a sheaf of notes as if trying not to sound important and failing a little. Lionel settled his gloves and looked ahead. The door was no longer closed. The long absurdity had passed into the calmer absurdity of normal parliamentary life, which is still absurd, but in a better managed manner. By evening, London would talk of the day as it always did, with more confidence than accuracy. Yet for Lionel, the thing itself had already become what he liked best. It had become settled, entered, and filed. There would be other debates after this. There would be dinners, bills, speeches, and delays on fresh subjects. There would be Charlotte's tables and Disraeli's beautiful complications, and lords discovering new reasons for old feelings. But on that July day, the law had finally bent enough to let fact pass through. A patient man had been admitted to the room where he had belonged for years, and the room, after all its reluctance, looked almost exactly the same. It is pleasant at the end of this long and patient tale to let a few images return and stand quietly in the mind. One is the warm heart of New Court in St. Swithin's Lane. The quill pens scratch, the good leather gives off its faint, steady smell. The beeswax on the wood catches a little light. Lionel sits where numbers behave better than people do. He sits in a room that can move money across Europe with less fuss than a footman arranging a tray. He sits in the original institution with a credit rating better than most sovereign nations. Yet even that famous house cannot obtain the simplest thing. It cannot secure him a proper place on a green bench a short walk away. That small absurdity has been with him all evening, like a mild and faithful joke. Another image lingers from Charlotte's rooms in Piccadilly. The flowers from the hothouse make the air soft and sweet. The candle wax grows warm. The soup arrives at exactly the right moment. A bishop appears beside a minister as if by nature, though nobody in London believes such things happen by nature where Charlotte is concerned. She places people as neatly as she places silver. She has long understood that the real business of the age often happens between the fish and the pudding. The House may debate under a lantern ceiling. The result often begins over soup. It is nice to remember that her work is quiet work. It leaves no ink on the fingers. It leaves no speech in Hansard. Yet it helps carry an 11-year argument over one dinner table after another. Then there is the oak-paneled chill of Westminster itself. The gas lamps hiss faintly. The passages smell of paper, wool, dust, and damp stone. The doorkeeper waits by habit and by profession. He has watched Lionel come to the bar, stop at the words he cannot say, and leave again more times than any patient servant should be asked to count. By now, he offers that small apologetic nod which belongs only to two men trapped inside the same routine. One has the votes, the other has the key, neither can alter the script. The House of Lords has spent year after year performing history's most exclusive velvet rope policy. It has been managed by men in ermine who wish to explain at soothing length that they object to no class of people in the abstract. They merely object to this particular elected man in the concrete. Lord Lyndhurst has said no with the care of a craftsman. He has found more constitutional language for delay than most people find words for love. Disraeli has spoken beautifully, and then every so often discovered a very small brake pedal beneath his polished boots. He has been a warm ally in public and a complicated one in practice. He is a reminder that a person can help a cause while still looking at it from a delicate angle. All of that slow motion comes to rest on one afternoon. The 26th of July in 1858 arrives without brass bands. That is one of its best qualities. Great changes are often kind enough to dress like ordinary days. The chamber holds its usual look. The green benches glow under the lantern ceiling. The wood has that dark rubbed shine that comes from years of sleeves and hands. Afternoon light reaches in and lies across the room in quiet bars. The gallery waits above. Charlotte is there, watching. She is not given a speech. She is not given a trumpet flourish, which is often the more moving thing. A private wait sits inside the public scene. It has the shape of dinners arranged, notes sent, tempers managed, hopes packed away, hopes unpacked again, and years spent being perfectly calm in rooms full of men who are less calm than they imagine. Lionel enters the chamber and walks its full length. There is no need to hurry now. After 11 years, haste would only feel untidy. He comes forward with the plain gravity that has served him better than display ever could. He places his right hand on the Hebrew Bible. His hat stays on his head, as Jewish custom requires. Even that small fact has a homely firmness to it. Parliament may have spent a decade behaving like a club, with very strict door policy. It still has to make room for a hat. The oath is spoken aloud in Hebrew. The sound enters the chamber and settles there. It is both unusual and entirely matter-of-fact. A thing can be new to a room and still belong in it at once. He does not force the moment. He does not decorate it. He simply takes his seat. This is the point toward which all the waiting has been inching. No theatrical storm follows. No ceiling opens. No bench collapses from constitutional strain. The House of Commons resumes its ordinary business as though this were entirely unremarkable. And from Lionel's place on the green bench, that plain continuation is exactly right. It is the best possible compliment. The seat is not meant to become a shrine. It is meant to become a seat. He has not spent 11 years trying to become a symbol only. He has spent 11 years trying to do what every other elected member does with much less ceremony. He means to sit, vote, listen, rise when needed, and otherwise be absorbed into the furniture of public life. There is a deep satisfaction in that modest outcome. Jewish emancipation in British life is suddenly visible in the simplest way. A Jewish member now sits in the Commons because voters sent him there. The law finally stopped pretending to be surprised by it, and the country moves on with its paperwork. That calmness matters. It says more than 100 speeches. It means that Jewish life in Britain can be public without being treated as a permanent exception. It means loyalty need not arrive disguised. It means citizenship can stop standing outside the door and can come in, hat and all, to take its place among the ledgers, the speeches, the committee rooms, and the dull but honorable work of governing. The whole long choral ends not with a flourish, but with absorption. There is something almost tender in that. A barrier that looked ancient turns out at last to be removable by ordinary procedure. Patient votes, stubborn return tickets from the City of London, and one man refusing to say 4 words he does not believe. The city has clicked the confirmation button again and again. Parliament has finally agreed to update its settings. Even now, the finest part of the scene may be its lack of drama. Charlotte watches from above. Lionel settles below. The chamber carries on. History, having made a great fuss for years, at last behaves itself, and lets the afternoon continue. Now the night can hold that scene in the gentlest way. The lamps are low, the wood is warm and memory, and the long argument has finally become still enough to rest beside. And it is pleasant to think that the doorkeeper, after all those careful turnings away, can at last give Lionel the same small nod as a man who is truly passing through. May your dreams be free of oaths whose final 4 words you cannot in good conscience pronounce. May your dreams be free of lords who kill perfectly good legislation before they have finished their morning claret. May your dreams be free of 11-year waiting rooms, however handsomely appointed. Thank you for listening. Keep the mind easy, and good night.